Dad opened the door. On a freezing Christmas night, I stood trembling on my father's porch, holding my 3-year-old daughter tightly in my arms. Her pajamas were soaked through from the driving snow. "He brought his mistress home," I whispered. His mother packed up our belongings, threw the two of us out of the house, and locked the door behind us. My father looked at his little granddaughter shivering from the cold. Then he tightened his grip on the keys in his hand. They picked the wrong family to mess with. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws who underestimated your worth. 30 minutes earlier, the holiday lights of our Buckhead estate were blindingly bright. I stood on the frozen slate of my front porch, shivering violently while clutching Zoe to my chest. The heavy door swung open, but it was not my husband Julian standing there. It was his mother, Valerie. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater and a smug expression, holding a black trash bag. She tossed it casually onto the snow-covered welcome mat. "Julian finally found a woman who understands his status," Valerie sneered, smoothing her slacks. "Brianna comes from a respectable family. She is a legacy member of the Lynx, and her father is a state senator. She is carrying the first actual heir to this family. You need to leave, Alana. Sign the divorce papers by Monday, or I will have you arrested for trespassing. This house is registered under Julian's corporate LLC." I stared at her, ignoring the biting wind. The LLC that I spent 80 hours a week structuring while he was playing golf with his frat brothers, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "The same LLC I saved from bankruptcy last year by liquidating his bad debt." Valerie let out a sharp laugh. "You are a glorified accountant, Alana. You crunch numbers. We are a prominent family. We host the Jack and Jill galas. We sit on the hospital board. You come from a man who drives garbage trucks for a living. You never belonged in our circle, and Julian is finally correcting that mistake." Through the massive front window, I could see the glow of the fireplace. Julian stood by the mantel, pouring 2 glasses of vintage champagne. Beside him stood Brianna, wearing my silk robe, laughing as she touched her slightly rounded stomach. He looked up, caught my eye through the glass, and looked momentarily uncomfortable. He set down his glass and walked to the front door, pushing past his mother. Julian stepped onto the porch, rubbing the back of his neck. He avoided making eye contact with Zoe, who was burying her face in my coat. "Look, Alana, let us not do this tonight," he said, keeping his voice low so his new family inside would not hear. "Brianna is moving in. We need space for the nursery. Go to a hotel. I will have my assistant email you a settlement offer next week. Do not ruin our holiday." He reached into his money clip, pulled out $200 bills, and shoved them into my coat pocket. "Take an Uber. We are done here." He stepped back inside and the door slammed shut. The deadbolt clicked into place, echoing through the freezing night air. I did not scream. I did not bang on the glass, begging for him to let me back in. I pulled the $200 from my pocket, looked at the bills, and felt a cold calm wash over me. Julian thought he held all the power because his name was on the deed. He forgot that I was the one who wrote the lease agreements for his entire financial firm. I wrapped my coat tighter around Zoe and called a car. The drive to my father's estate took 40 minutes. We left the flashy new money subdivisions of Buckhead and entered the quiet, sprawling properties of the old money districts. My father Isaiah did not live in a glass mansion. He lived on a massive private compound surrounded by ancient oak trees purchased with 30 years of grueling hard work. Valerie loved to mock him as a garbage man because he owned a commercial waste management company. What she failed to realize was that Isaiah owned the logistics supply chain and waste disposal contracts for half the commercial properties in the state. The heavy iron gates parted as my rideshare approached. I paid the driver, tipped him the $200 Julian had handed me, and carried Zoe up the wide stone steps. I knocked twice. My father opened the door immediately, as if he had been waiting for us. He wore a simple gray sweater and worn jeans, but his presence filled the doorway. He took one look at Zoe's tear-stained face and immediately pulled us into the warm foyer. "What happened?" Isaiah asked, taking Zoe from my arms and wrapping her in a thick woolen blanket from the hall closet. "Julian kicked us out," I said, my voice finally breaking just a fraction. He moved his pregnant assistant into the house. Valerie threw a trash bag of my clothes onto the driveway and told me the house belongs to his company. She reminded me that we are just garbage people who do not fit into their high society plans. Isaiah did not yell. He did not curse. He handed Zoe to his housekeeper, who had rushed into the hall carrying hot tea. He guided me into his massive wood-paneled study and closed the door. He walked over to his desk, picked up his reading glasses, and pulled a heavy leather-bound ledger from the top drawer. "They think wealth is about wearing expensive suits and hosting charity galas," he said, his voice dangerously low. "They think power is a zip code." He picked up his phone and dialed a number. He did not wait for a greeting on the other end. "Martin," he said, staring out the window into the dark snow. "Execute the clause on the Buckhead properties. All of them. Yes, freeze the commercial credit lines too. Call the bank president and tell him I am pulling my accounts if they clear a single check for Julian's tech firm by morning." Isaiah hung up the phone and turned back to me. He placed his hands firmly on my shoulders. "They wanted to play corporate games with a restructuring consultant and a logistics baron," he whispered. "They picked the wrong family to mess with. By sunrise, Julian is going to learn that a house is just a building, but we own the ground it sits on." I looked at my father, feeling the freezing despair melt into sharp, focused resolve. Julian wanted a divorce. He wanted to strip me of everything I had built. He had no idea that I already had full access to his hidden offshore ledgers. "We are not just taking the house back, Dad," I said, drying my eyes. "I am taking the entire firm." The drive back to the Buckhead estate on Christmas morning was blindingly bright. The snow had settled heavily over the sprawling manicured lawns, making the neighborhood look like a picturesque holiday postcard. But I was not there to celebrate. I sat in the passenger seat of a police cruiser, staring straight ahead, with my hands folded quietly in my lap. Officer Davis, a kind older man with tired eyes, parked his vehicle in the circular driveway, right behind Julian's brand-new Porsche. The sports car had a massive red bow tied to the roof, a sickening reminder of the money my husband had squandered while claiming our accounts were tight. "I just need to get my daughter's asthma nebulizer," I told the officer, keeping my voice completely steady. "I know exactly where it is. I will not take more than 5 minutes of your time." He nodded sympathetically and followed me up the snow-covered steps. I did not bother knocking. My key still worked in the heavy oak front door. The door swung open, revealing a house filled with the scent of cinnamon, expensive pine, and freshly roasted coffee. Loud Christmas music and laughter echoed from the formal dining room down the hall. They were having a lavish holiday brunch, completely unbothered, as if they had not just thrown a mother and her sick 3-year-old child into the freezing snow mere hours prior. Before I could take a single step toward the staircase, a tall figure stepped into the hallway, deliberately blocking my path. It was Connor, my sister-in-law, Alicia's husband. Connor was a venture capitalist who had inherited his immense wealth and carried his white privilege like a loaded weapon. He stood there in a tailored cashmere sweater, swirling spiked eggnog in a crystal mug. Alicia stood right behind him, wearing a silk robe and a look of deep, condescending annoyance. "Look who decided to show up," Connor said, flashing a bright smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "I thought Julian made it very clear last night that you needed to stay away, Alana. You are really ruining the holiday vibe we have going on here." I kept my posture straight and my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am here for Zoe's medical equipment, Connor. Move out of my way right now." Connor took a slow, deliberate sip of his eggnog and shifted his weight, filling the space between the banister and the wall. He chuckled softly, shaking his head, as if he were dealing with a confused and unruly child. "Listen, Alana, let me explain how the real world works, because you seem to be struggling with the concept. Julian is a visionary. He is building something massive and unprecedented. I just pumped $10 million of my venture capital funds into his startup. We are taking the company public next year, and the optics have to be absolutely flawless. He needs a wife who understands the game. Brianna is a public relations dream. She is young, she is eager, and she fits the image of a successful Black entrepreneur perfectly. You, on the other hand, are just a stressed-out number cruncher who never knows when to smile for the cameras. You do not fit the brand anymore." I stared at him, letting his arrogant, ignorant words hang in the heavy air. "The brand?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You mean the company that I built from scratch while you two were busy having expensive lunches? The company where I managed the tax liabilities, filed the corporate charter, and hid his reckless personal spending so your firm would not pull your funding?" Alicia stepped forward, crossing her arms defensively. Her loyalty to her wealthy white husband and her brother Julian completely blinded her to the reality of the situation. "Do not act like you are the genius here, Alana," she scoffed. "Julian has the talent and the charisma. You are just his glorified bookkeeper. You should be incredibly grateful he kept you around this long and let you live in this house. Julian is upgrading his life, and you need to accept that with some grace instead of throwing a tantrum." Connor smirked and leaned closer, invading my personal space. His voice dropped into a patronizing whisper meant only for me. "Sign the quick divorce papers, Alana. Take whatever meager scraps Julian offers you and walk away quietly. If you try to fight this, I will personally unleash my Wall Street lawyers on you. We will tie you up in aggressive litigation for the next 10 years. We will bury you so deep in legal fees you will not even be able to afford that garbage truck your father drives. Let Julian keep the house and let him keep the kid. It is much better for everyone involved." I did not scream. I did not cry. My mind simply shifted into the cold, calculating space it always went when I was liquidating a bankrupt and corrupt corporation. Connor thought he was intimidating me. He did not realize he had just handed me a roadmap to his own destruction. Officer Davis stepped forward, resting his hand heavily on his duty belt. "The lady is here to retrieve necessary medical supplies, sir," he said, his voice echoing with authority. "Step aside immediately, or we are going to have a serious problem." Connor glared at the police officer, his arrogant smile fading into a scowl. He slowly moved out of the way, holding his free hand up in mock surrender. "Go ahead," he muttered, taking another sip of his eggnog. "Grab your little machine and get out of my sight." I walked past them without another word, but I did not go straight upstairs to Zoe's room. I turned sharply down the hallway and walked directly into Julian's home office. The room was perfectly organized, exactly as I had left it. Julian was a creature of habit, and he was incredibly lazy. He relied on me for every single detail of his financial and personal life, which meant I knew exactly where he hid all his secrets. I walked behind his massive oak desk and reached underneath the bottom right drawer. There was a false bottom panel held securely in place by a magnetic lock. I pressed my thumb against the hidden latch and it clicked open smoothly. Inside the hidden compartment was a thick leather-bound ledger and a stack of heavy manila folders. I pulled the folders out and flipped open the first one. My blood ran completely cold as my eyes scanned the legal jargon. It was a property deed accompanied by a series of high-value bank transfer authorizations. Julian had not just kicked me out of the marital house, he had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage. But the loan was not on our shared home. He had taken out a $2 million commercial loan against my childhood home, the pristine property my father had transferred into a family trust for me years ago. I stared intensely at the signature line on the bottom of the loan agreement. My signature was forged perfectly, mimicking every loop and curve of my handwriting. Right next to the forged signature was the official stamp of a notary public. I recognized the name on the stamp immediately. It was a notary who worked directly inside Connor's venture capital firm. Julian had leveraged my family's private legacy to fund his flashy lifestyle and Brianna's designer wardrobe, and Connor had actively helped him commit the fraud. They really thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was just a bitter, discarded wife who would roll over and disappear into the snow. I carefully slipped the forged documents and the ledger into my large leather tote bag. Julian and Connor were about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you steal from a woman who professionally tracks hidden assets and destroys corrupt companies for a living. The heavy glass doors of my restructuring firm slid open to the quiet hum of servers and the faint glow of dual monitors. It was the morning after Christmas, a day most people spent recovering from holiday excess or enjoying time with their families. I was already at my desk before the sun even thought about coming up. This was my sanctuary. Julian and his elitist mother Valerie always loved to mock my career, calling me a glorified bookkeeper to their high society friends. They fundamentally misunderstood what a corporate restructuring consultant actually does. I do not just sit around and balance budgets. I dissect failing empires. I track missing assets across global networks, and I dismantle corrupt companies brick by brick. Sitting in my ergonomic chair, I booted up my primary workstation. The forged mortgage documents from Julian's hidden ledger sat on my desk like a ticking time bomb. He had used my childhood home, the property my father had worked decades to secure, to secretly fund his fake lifestyle. Now it was time to look under the hood of his supposedly brilliant financial technology startup. I accessed the public financial records, pulling up every securities filing and quarterly report connected to Julian's company and Connor's venture capital firm. Yesterday on my front porch, Connor had proudly boasted about pumping $10 million of his fund into Julian's vision. I started tracing the digital paper trail to see exactly where that $10 million went. On the surface, everything looked pristine. Julian's startup promised revolutionary payment processing for minority-owned businesses, a narrative that played perfectly to the media. But as I cross-referenced the capital expenditures with the operating costs, the cracks quickly began to show. The burn rate was absolutely astronomical. Millions of dollars were categorized under vague research and development fees or untraceable offshore marketing expenses. Julian was moving money out the back door faster than the company was bringing it in through the front. He was running a highly leveraged house of cards masked by slick public relations campaigns and empty corporate buzzwords. My intense focus was suddenly broken by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching my office. The glass door swung open without a knock, and a man in a cheap, wrinkled suit walked right in holding a thick manila envelope. He did not bother to introduce himself or ask if I was busy. He just dropped the envelope directly onto my keyboard, blocking my monitors. "You have been served, Alana," he said with a lazy smirk, before turning around and walking right back out. I opened the envelope with steady hands and pulled out the legal documents. It was an emergency petition for full custody of my daughter Zoe. My stomach twisted into violent knots as I read the outrageous claims printed on the pages. Julian was legally arguing that my demanding work schedule made me an unfit and absent mother. He claimed that his new stable home environment with Brianna was far better suited for raising a young child. I flipped to the financial demands at the very back of the legal packet. Julian was not just trying to take my daughter away from me out of spite. He was formally demanding that I pay me $6,000 a month in child support. Because his tech startup was technically still in a pre-revenue phase, he had legally classified himself as a low-income earner, despite driving a brand-new Porsche and living in a sprawling luxury estate. My phone buzzed loudly on the wooden desk. It was a text message from Julian. "Do not try to fight this, Alana. You do not have the money to beat Connor's Wall Street lawyers. Give me primary custody and pay the support, or we will drag your name through the mud in family court. You are completely outmatched." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. He actually thought a custody threat would break me. He honestly believed the threat of Connor's expensive lawyers would force me into terrified submission. He forgot that I spend my entire life destroying men exactly like him. I tossed the custody papers aside and turned back to my dual monitors. The anger did not paralyze me, it fueled me, pushing my focus into overdrive. I dove deeper into the financial architecture of his startup. If Julian was actively hiding assets to claim low income for child support, the money had to be parked somewhere inaccessible. I accessed the developer repository for his financial application, using the administrative credentials I had set up for him 2 years ago, when he was too lazy to figure it out himself. I bypassed the glossy user interface and went straight into the back-end code, looking specifically at where the transaction fees and investment injections were being routed. It took me 3 rigorous hours of tracing complex lines of code and decrypting offshore routing numbers. Then I finally found it. Hidden deep within the application's payment gateway was an automated diversion protocol. Every single time Connor's venture capital firm injected funds into the startup, a significant percentage of that money was immediately siphoned off the top. The diverted funds were not going into Julian's domestic accounts or business holdings. They were being routed automatically to a discreet shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. I pulled up the International Registry database and ran a comprehensive search on the shell company's registration details. The corporate veil was thick, but Julian was arrogant and sloppy. I easily traced the primary beneficiary of the offshore account bypassing the fake executive names used to mask the true owner. A name popped up on my screen in stark black text, making my heart skip a beat. The primary beneficiary holding over $2 million of stolen venture capital money was not Julian, it was Brianna. Julian was not just cheating on me with his young public relations coordinator. He and his 25-year-old mistress were actively embezzling millions of dollars directly from his arrogant white brother-in-law. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and smiled as a cold sense of absolute victory washed over me. Connor thought he was funding the next big tech genius who was going to make him even richer. Instead, he was unknowingly funding Brianna's designer wardrobe and Julian's criminal exit strategy. They had served me with custody papers this morning, thinking I was just a powerless, discarded wife. They had absolutely no idea I was about to hand them both over to the federal government. 5 days later, the calendar turned to a new year. While the rest of the city was sleeping off their champagne hangovers, I was wide awake, meticulously organizing a stack of freshly stamped legal documents. Julian and his mother Valerie were hosting their annual New Year's Day brunch at the Oakwood Country Club. It was an exclusive invite-only event meant to solidify their standing among the city's black elite. This was the exact environment Valerie lived for. She thrived on the polished mahogany, the crystal chandeliers, and the hushed conversations of people boasting about their stock portfolios and summer homes in Martha's Vineyard. I knew exactly what they were doing today. They were using this brunch to formally introduce Brianna to their high society friends, attempting to smoothly replace me with a younger, more compliant version of a corporate wife. I pulled my car up to the valet stand and stepped out into the freezing January air. I was not wearing the modest pastel dresses Valerie used to pressure me into wearing. I wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit and carried a thick manila envelope. The valet hesitated for a moment, recognizing me from previous years before silently taking my keys. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and walked directly into the grand dining room. The space was filled with the soft sounds of a live jazz quartet and the clinking of expensive silverware. Julian stood near an extravagant ice sculpture carved in the shape of his company logo, holding a mimosa and laughing with Connor. Brianna stood pressed against Julian's side, wearing a designer dress paid for by the venture capital funds they were currently embezzling. Valerie was holding court at the center table, surrounded by her friends from the Lynx network, pointing proudly at her son. The moment I stepped onto the plush carpet, the jazz music seemed to fade into the background. A ripple of silence washed over the immediate crowd. Julian noticed the shift in the room and turned around. His relaxed smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Brianna grabbed his arm tightly, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits. Valerie, however, did not look panicked. She looked absolutely furious that her perfect social orchestration was being interrupted. She marched across the dining room, her high heels sinking into the carpet, placing herself firmly between me and the rest of her wealthy guests. "What do you think you are doing?" Valerie demanded, keeping her voice in a harsh, forced whisper so her friends would not overhear. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here today. You are no longer welcome at this club, Alana. We removed you from the family membership account the morning after Christmas." Julian hurried over with Connor trailing close behind him. Julian looked around at the staring guests and forced a tight fake smile, trying to maintain his public image. "Alana, this is completely inappropriate," he said, adjusting his expensive watch. "If you are here to beg for a better divorce settlement, you are wasting your time. I told you my lawyer will email you the terms on Monday. Security is going to escort you out before you embarrass yourself any further." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply held out the thick manila envelope and pressed it firmly against Julian's chest. "I am not here to beg, Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "I am here to formally serve you." Julian instinctively grabbed the envelope before it could fall to the floor. Connor let out a loud, arrogant laugh, crossing his arms over his chest. "Are you seriously serving him with family court papers at a country club?" Connor mocked, shaking his head. "You really are desperate, Alana. Julian already told you we have the best legal team on Wall Street. You cannot afford to fight us over a few $1,000s in child support." "It is not a family court petition," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Julian. "Open it." Julian ripped the seal and pulled out the heavy stack of documents. The color drained from his face entirely as his eyes scanned the bold legal print on the first page. It was a court-ordered subpoena for comprehensive financial discovery. "What is this?" Julian stammered, his hands suddenly shaking. "This demands access to my corporate servers. This demands 10 years of unredacted bank statements, including all international wire transfers." I smiled a cold, practiced smile. "When you filed for sole custody and claimed you were a low-income earner to extort child support out of me, you opened the door for a full forensic audit of your life," I explained smoothly. The judge was very interested in how an executive with overdrawn personal accounts managed to secure a $2 million commercial loan against a property he did not own. "By Monday morning, my restructuring firm will have legal access to every single server database and offshore routing number connected to your financial technology startup." Brianna let out a small, sharp gasp and took a step backward away from Julian. Connor stopped laughing, his arrogant posture stiffening as he heard the words offshore routing number. Valerie saw her son trembling and completely lost her temper. The facade of the polite society matron vanished. She stepped closer to me, her face twisted in a vicious sneer. "You are nothing but a vindictive, bitter woman," Valerie shouted, no longer caring who heard her. "You think throwing some legal papers around makes you powerful. You have no idea how the real world works. Your father drives garbage trucks for a living. He hauls trash. You come from absolute nothing, and you never belonged in our circle. You are a glorified calculator, and Julian is finally rid of you." The entire dining room was dead silent. The wealthy guests watched with wide eyes, waiting for my reaction to the brutal classist insult. I did not flinch. I just looked past Valerie toward the heavy brass doors at the entrance of the dining room. Right on cue, the doors swung open with a loud thud. My father Isaiah walked into the pristine country club. He was not wearing a tuxedo or a tailored suit. He wore his heavy steel-toed work boots, a thick canvas jacket, and a faded baseball cap. The dirt and salt from the winter roads clung to his boots, leaving visible tracks on the expensive imported carpet. The club manager, Mr. Sterling, rushed forward, waving his hands frantically in the air. "Sir, you cannot be in here," Mr. Sterling sputtered, gesturing to Isaiah's work clothes. "This is a private event. We have a strict dress code. I need you to leave the dining area immediately." Isaiah ignored the manager and walked straight up to Valerie. He towered over her, his presence radiating the kind of quiet, heavy power that only comes from decades of back-breaking labor. He looked down at her designer dress and then shifted his gaze to Julian's trembling hands. "My garbage trucks do not just haul trash," Valerie, Isaiah said, his voice a deep, thunderous rumble that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "My commercial logistics empire owns the supply chain contracts for this entire county." Isaiah turned his head slowly and looked directly at the club manager, who was now standing frozen in terror. He reached into his canvas jacket and pulled out a stack of vendor contracts. "I supply the imported food for your kitchen, Mr. Sterling." Isaiah continued, dropping the contracts onto a nearby dining table. "I supply the luxury linens for your event halls. I manage the waste disposal, the snow removal, and the commercial heating oil that keeps this building warm." The manager swallowed hard, his face turning completely pale as he realized exactly who was standing in his dining room. Isaiah pointed a calloused finger directly at Julian and Valerie. "Cancel their vendor contracts," Isaiah commanded, his tone absolute and unforgiving. Cut the supply lines. Effective immediately. Let them eat snow. Panic erupted through the dining room as the realization of what was happening set in. The elite guests began murmuring in alarm, realizing their prestigious sanctuary was about to be completely shut down. Valerie staggered backward, clutching her chest as her social standing disintegrated before her eyes. Julian dropped the subpoena, the papers scattering across the floor. I turned on my heel and walked out of the club alongside my father, leaving them to drown in the mess they created. The heavy glass doors of the downtown coffee shop offered a quiet sanctuary from the freezing January wind. I sat in a secluded corner booth with my laptop open and my hands wrapped around a warm mug of dark roast coffee. It had been 48 hours since my father walked into the Oakwood Country Club and completely dismantled Valerie and Julian. The memory of the club manager panicking and my father canceling their vendor contracts brought a small smile to my face. But I knew the war was far from over. I was currently running a deep diagnostic on the offshore routing numbers I had extracted from Julian's financial technology application. The digital trail was undeniable. Millions of dollars of venture capital money were being funneled directly into a Cayman Islands account registered to his mistress Brianna. The bell above the cafe door chimed, pulling me out of my intense concentration. I looked up and saw Connor storming into the quiet shop. He was not wearing his usual casual cashmere sweater. Today he wore a sharp navy blue tailored suit that screamed aggressive Wall Street money. His eyes scanned the room with a predatory intensity until they locked onto me sitting in the corner. He did not bother ordering a drink or speaking to the barista. He marched straight toward my table, his heavy leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. Connor slid into the booth across from me without asking for permission. The arrogant smile he usually wore at family gatherings was completely gone. His face was tense and his eyes were cold and dark. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the small wooden table, completely invading my personal space. "You pulled a very cute stunt at the country club yesterday," Alana Connor said, his voice low and dripping with pure venom. "Your father threw his weight around and caused a minor logistical headache for the club management. Valerie is throwing a tantrum and Julian is terrified, but I am not them. I do not play petty social games and I do not care about vendor contracts. I deal in real power and you are seriously overstepping your boundaries." I kept my hands resting calmly on my laptop keyboard. I did not break eye contact or show a single ounce of intimidation. "I am simply auditing my husband's financial records, Connor." I replied, my tone perfectly even. "If Julian has nothing to hide, then he has absolutely nothing to worry about." Connor let out a harsh, humorless laugh that turned the heads of a few nearby customers. He leaned even closer until I could smell the sharp scent of his expensive cologne. "Let us drop the polite act right now," he said, narrowing his eyes. "You think you are incredibly smart because you crunched some numbers and structured a few holding companies for Julian. You think you can use legal discovery to squeeze a better settlement out of him. But you need a serious reality check about how the world actually works." He paused for a moment to let his words sink in before continuing his arrogant monologue. "You are a black woman navigating corporate America," Alana Connor stated, his voice dripping with condescending white privilege. "You have worked hard to build your little consulting reputation, but you are entirely expendable. I sit on the board of directors for 3 of the largest financial institutions in the country. I play golf with the managing partners of every major restructuring firm in the city. I possess the kind of untouchable generational wealth and network that you could not even begin to comprehend." I stared at him, letting his vicious threats hang in the quiet air of the coffee shop. "If you do not drop this ridiculous subpoena," Connor continued, his tone shifting into a direct threat, "I will personally make sure you never work in the financial sector again. I can snap my fingers and make you completely unemployable by tomorrow morning. Every firm you try to consult for will drop your contracts. Every bank you try to work with will blacklist your name. I will ruin your entire career and leave you with absolutely nothing." He tapped his index finger against the wooden table to emphasize his absolute authority. "Here is exactly what is going to happen," he commanded. "You are going to call your lawyers right now and withdraw the financial discovery subpoena. You are going to sign the divorce papers Julian gave you. You are going to let Julian keep the Buckhead estate because it belongs to the company. And you are going to give him full legal custody of Zoe so he does not have to pay you a single dime of child support. Connor sat back in the booth, crossing his arms over his chest, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. Do this quietly, Alana, and I will let you keep your little accounting career. Fight me, and I will bury you so deep you will not be able to afford a studio apartment. I took a slow, calm sip of my dark roast coffee. I did not shout or argue with his deeply offensive and racist threats. My mind was completely focused on the absolute destruction of the arrogant man sitting across from me. Connor thought he held every single card in the deck. He thought his money and his skin color made him a god among mere mortals. I carefully closed my laptop screen and set my coffee mug down. I reached down into my heavy leather tote bag resting on the floor beside my feet. I pulled out a sleek red folder containing the printed back-end code and the international registration documents for the Cayman Islands Shell Company. I placed the folder on the table right between us. I am not here to negotiate a divorce settlement, Connor, I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. I am here because I thought you might want to see exactly what your visionary brother-in-law has been doing with your venture capital funds. Connor looked down at the red folder and frowned. He slowly reached out and flipped it open. His arrogant confidence shattered into a million pieces the moment his eyes registered the highlighted lines of code. He saw the automated diversion protocol. He saw the offshore routing numbers. He flipped to the second page and saw Brianna's name listed as the primary beneficiary of the hidden Cayman account. The blood completely drained from Connor's face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. His hands began to shake as he realized that the brilliant financial technology startup he had heavily invested in was actually a massive embezzlement scheme. Julian and Brianna were actively stealing his $10 million investment right out from under his nose. "Where did you get this?" Connor demanded, his voice suddenly breathless and panicked. "How long have they been siphoning my money? Give me the original digital files right now, Alana. I need to take this to my internal security team and handle Julian quietly before my investors find out I was played for a fool." I reached across the table and slowly pulled the red folder out of his trembling hands. I slipped the documents back into my leather tote bag and offered him a chilling, perfectly calm smile. "I am not giving these files to you, Connor," I whispered, watching the sheer terror wash over his face. "I am giving them directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission." I left Connor sitting perfectly still in that coffee shop booth, clutching his lukewarm dark roast, while his entire venture capital empire flashed before his eyes. He had tried to use his wealth and white privilege to crush a black woman in corporate America, but he severely underestimated the very woman he was threatening. I walked out into the freezing January wind, feeling lighter than I had in years. The Securities and Exchange Commission already had the encrypted files waiting in their secure inbox by the time my car heater kicked on. But I did not have time to celebrate my sudden victory over Connor. The very next morning, I had to face Julian in family court to fight for the one thing that actually mattered to me: my daughter Zoe. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse loomed ahead of me like an impenetrable fortress. I walked through the metal detectors, wearing a tailored navy blue power suit, my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. Beside me walked my attorney Marcus, a ruthless family law litigator who specialized in dismantling high-net-worth narcissists. He carried a single black leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of Julian. We entered courtroom 4B and took our seats at the petitioner's table. The air was thick and stale, smelling of floor wax and nervous tension. A few minutes later, the heavy doors swung open and Julian walked in looking like he had just stepped off the glossy cover of a luxury business magazine. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit, with a subtle silk tie, his hair perfectly styled to project the image of a responsible, loving father. Valerie trailed closely behind him, wrapped in an expensive mink coat and wearing her signature pearls. They both looked incredibly smug, completely unaware of the devastating digital paper trail I had unearthed the day before. Judge Harrison, a stern woman with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, called the emergency custody hearing to order. Julian's sleazy attorney, a man named Robert, who looked like he billed by the insult, immediately began his dramatic opening statement. He painted a tragic, completely fabricated picture of a successful technology founder, desperately trying to protect his innocent 3-year-old daughter from an unstable and erratic mother. Robert claimed I was a bitter workaholic who spent 80 hours a week staring at spreadsheets, while Julian was supposedly the primary caregiver keeping the household running. I sat there perfectly still, letting the vicious lies wash over me. I knew that reacting emotionally was exactly what they wanted. They wanted the angry black woman trope to materialize in front of the judge, but I remained as cold as ice. Julian confidently took the witness stand and adjusted the microphone. He looked directly at the judge, projecting an aura of calm, absolute authority. "Your Honor, I just want what is best for my daughter," he lied smoothly, putting a hand over his heart. "Alana has become completely unhinged since our separation. She crashed a private country club event just to harass my elderly mother. She works endless hours at her restructuring firm and routinely neglects Zoe's basic daily needs. I bought our house. I provide the lifestyle. She is just a bitter employee who refuses to accept that our marriage is over." He continued weaving a masterful tale of his own immense generosity, claiming he had offered me a fair financial settlement, which I allegedly rejected out of pure spite. He stated on the public record that his financial technology startup was generating massive revenue and providing a stable, luxurious environment for Zoe to thrive in. When Julian finally stepped down, Valerie took the stand to corroborate his fabricated reality. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a lace handkerchief, dabbing at completely dry eyes. "It breaks my heart to see my beautiful granddaughter in such a chaotic environment," Valerie testified, her voice trembling with fake manufactured emotion. "Alana comes from a very different background than we do. Her father drives garbage trucks for a living. She never fully adjusted to our elite social circle, and the pressure of keeping up appearances has clearly caused a severe mental breakdown. She is volatile and emotionally unstable. Julian is a brilliant visionary who can provide Zoe with the absolute best education and opportunities. Alana simply cannot offer that level of sophisticated stability." Judge Harrison peered over her reading glasses and turned her sharp attention to my table. She looked highly skeptical, weighing the heavy accusations that had just been dumped into her courtroom. Marcus stood up slowly, deliberately, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not launch into a passionate, emotional defense of my character. He did not argue about my father's garbage trucks or my intense work schedule. Marcus simply picked up a thick stack of certified bank statements from his leather briefcase and approached the bench. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has painted a beautiful picture of immense wealth and stable family life," Marcus said, his voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "However, we have a slightly different perspective on Mr. Julian's alleged financial security and his fitness as a parent." Marcus handed the heavy stack of documents directly to the judge and provided a duplicate copy to Julian's visibly confused lawyer. "These are the certified, unredacted financial records obtained through a direct subpoena of Mr. Julian's personal and business accounts," Marcus explained smoothly, walking back to our table. I watched Julian's smug smile completely vanish. He gripped the edge of the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Your Honor, as you can see on page 4, Mr. Julian's primary domestic accounts are not generating massive revenue. In fact, they are currently overdrawn by exactly $2 million. He recently took out a fraudulent commercial loan against my client's childhood home, using a forged signature to fund his lavish lifestyle." A loud collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Valerie dropped her lace handkerchief, staring at her son in absolute unfiltered horror. Julian's sleazy lawyer rapidly flipped through the pages, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized his client had just committed blatant perjury on the stand. But Marcus was not finished destroying him. "Furthermore, Your Honor, these records clearly indicate that the $10 million of venture capital funding Mr. Julian recently secured has been systematically embezzled. The funds are being automatically routed to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, registered under the name of his 25-year-old mistress, Brianna." Judge Harrison slammed the bank statements down on her heavy wooden desk, her eyes blazing with absolute fury. She glared down at Julian, who was now visibly sweating and physically shaking in his expensive tailored suit. "Mr. Julian, you have blatantly lied to this court, and you have presented a severe financial and moral risk to this child," Judge Harrison declared, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "I am stripping you of all temporary custody, effective immediately, and I am granting full primary custody to the mother. Furthermore, I am ordering a full comprehensive forensic audit of your entire life. Do not even attempt to leave the state." I sat back in my leather chair and allowed a small, genuine smile to cross my face. Julian thought he could use his fake wealth and his aggressive lawyers to bully me into giving up my daughter and paying him child support. He had absolutely no idea that I had already burned his entire corporate empire to the ground. The fallout from Judge Harrison issuing that severe court order was immediate and completely catastrophic. Before Julian even made it out of the courthouse parking lot, the news of the mandatory forensic audit had reached the board of directors at his financial technology company. The board was already operating in a state of sheer panic because the Securities and Exchange Commission had quietly frozen several of their primary operating accounts early that morning. My anonymous tip to the federal investigators had triggered an automated lockdown on all offshore transfers. By the time Julian arrived at his glass and steel corporate headquarters in Midtown, the board had convened an emergency meeting. Corporate bylaws and strict federal regulations dictated their next move. To prevent a complete freeze of all corporate assets and avoid immediate federal indictment, the board was legally required to bring in an independent restructuring firm. This firm would have absolute authority to audit every single ledger, bypass executive passwords, and seize all digital hardware. They needed a firm with top-tier federal clearance, and they needed it before the markets opened the following day. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the top-floor boardroom was incredibly tense. I stood outside the heavy, frosted glass doors, listening to the muffled sounds of an intense argument. Connor was pacing back and forth, furiously berating Julian. Even through the thick glass, I could hear the absolute rage in Connor's voice as he realized his $10 million venture capital investment was tied up in a massive federal fraud investigation. Julian sat at the massive marble table looking completely defeated. His expensive designer suit looked rumpled, and his perfectly styled hair was a mess. He kept checking his phone desperately, hoping his lawyers could find a loophole to block the audit. Sitting quietly in the corner was Brianna. She was nervously chewing on her perfectly manicured nails and clutching her oversized designer tote bag tightly against her chest. They were all waiting for the lead auditor from the appointed restructuring firm to arrive. They desperately hoped they could intimidate or manipulate whoever walked through those doors, just like they manipulated everyone else in their elite social circle. I adjusted the collar of my sharp black suit and pushed the heavy glass doors open. The heavy thud of the doors swinging shut echoed through the massive boardroom. The arguing instantly stopped. Connor spun around his face, turning bright red as his eyes locked onto mine. Julian physically recoiled in his leather chair, as if he had just seen a ghost. Brianna let out a small, sharp gasp and sank deeper into her corner seat, gripping her bag even tighter. "What the hell are you doing here?" Connor exploded, slamming his hands down on the marble table. "This is a closed corporate meeting for executive board members only. Security is going to drag you out of this building, Alana." I did not flinch or break my steady stride. I walked directly to the head of the marble table and placed my heavy leather briefcase down. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be, Connor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and authoritative. Julian jumped out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is an absolute conflict of interest," Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are my estranged wife. You are actively suing me in family court. You cannot possibly be the independent auditor. I am calling my legal team right now to have this entire process thrown out." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound with a heavy blue federal seal. I tossed the stack onto the center of the table, letting it slide perfectly until it hit Julian's shaking hands. You can call whoever you want, Julian, I replied smoothly. But you might want to read the federal mandate first. My restructuring firm is the only agency in this specific financial sector currently authorized by the Securities and Exchange Commission to handle an embezzlement case of this massive magnitude. The federal judge reviewed the conflict of interest claim this morning and officially waived it because the evidence of offshore fraud was so overwhelming. I am operating under a direct federal court order. Connor stared at the blue seal on the documents, his arrogant demeanor completely collapsing. He realized in that exact moment that all his elite country club connections and generational wealth could not protect him from a federal investigation. He was trapped in a room with the very woman he had threatened just days ago, and now she held his entire financial future in the palm of her hand. "Sit down, gentlemen," I commanded, my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "This audit begins right now. You are legally required to hand over your company laptops, your corporate phones, and all access tokens. Failure to comply will result in immediate federal obstruction charges." Julian sank back into his chair, his face completely pale as he stared at the federal mandate. He slowly pushed his silver laptop across the smooth marble table. Connor clenched his jaw in pure rage, but he silently surrendered his devices, knowing he had absolutely no other choice. His massive ego was finally entirely crushed under the weight of his own terrible business decisions. As I began logging their devices into my secure inventory system, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. Brianna had quietly stood up from her chair. Her face was covered in a cold sweat, and her eyes were darting nervously toward the boardroom exit. She thought all the attention was focused on Julian and Connor. She slowly slung her heavy designer tote bag over her shoulder and began inching toward the frosted glass doors, trying to slip out completely unnoticed. I saw the distinct rectangular bulge pressing against the soft leather of her bag. It was a high-capacity external hard drive, the exact hard drive Julian used to authorize the offshore transfers to her Cayman Islands shell company. She was carrying the most crucial piece of evidence right out of the room. "Going somewhere, Brianna?" I asked, without looking up from my inventory sheet. She froze in her tracks, her hand hovering just inches from the door handle. "I just need to use the restroom," Brianna stammered, her voice trembling with panic. "I am not an employee here, so I do not need to surrender anything." She violently shoved the heavy glass door open and sprinted down the carpeted hallway toward the private executive elevators. She frantically mashed the call button, looking back over her shoulder with sheer terror in her eyes. She thought she was going to escape, with the only physical evidence that directly tied her to the stolen venture capital funds. She actually believed she could outsmart a federal audit by simply walking away. I casually picked up my phone and pressed a single button connecting directly to the building's security desk. "Yes, this is the lead federal auditor," I said, watching Brianna through the glass walls as the elevator doors slowly began to open. "There is a woman in a beige dress attempting to board the executive elevator. Do not let those doors close. Confiscate her designer bag immediately." Brianna stepped into the elevator, thinking she had won. But before the metal doors could slide shut, two massive security guards stepped directly into the frame, blocking her exit entirely. The two massive security guards easily confiscated the heavy designer tote bag from Brianna. She collapsed against the elevator wall, sobbing uncontrollably, as my restructuring team secured the stolen hard drive into a tamper-proof federal evidence bag. The look of utter defeat on Julian and Connor's faces was something I would savor for the rest of my life. But I knew Julian well enough to understand that a cornered narcissist never completely surrenders. He was incredibly arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. If Brianna had a physical hard drive acting as a digital key, then Julian absolutely had physical backup servers hidden somewhere off-site. The Securities and Exchange Commission had locked down their cloud infrastructure, but federal agents had not yet secured their physical off-site data centers because those locations were deliberately kept off the official corporate ledgers. I sat in my downtown office later that night watching the rain beat against the glass windows. My forensic accounting team was working in shifts, tearing through the data we had legally seized from the boardroom. Around midnight, an automated alert flashed across my encrypted monitor. A massive data migration protocol had just been triggered from a secondary IP address linked to Julian's executive credentials. He was trying to download the remaining offshore transactional history directly onto a local server network before my team could lock him out of the backend entirely. He was panicking and making desperate, reckless mistakes. Across the city in this pouring rain, Julian was frantically loading heavy steel backup servers into the back of an unmarked rented cargo van. He had stripped off his expensive tailored suit jacket and was working in a soaked dress shirt, his perfectly styled hair plastered to his forehead. Brianna stood shivering in the passenger seat of the van, looking terrified as she watched him struggle with the heavy equipment. They were abandoning the sleek corporate world of venture capital and engaging in a desperate midnight heist to save themselves from federal prison. Julian slammed the cargo van door shut and jumped into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. He told Brianna they were taking the servers to a highly secure private warehouse in the industrial district. He had used a third-party shell company to rent the space weeks ago, paying cash to ensure his name was completely untraceable. He believed he was outsmarting the federal government. He thought if he could just hide the physical servers, he could wipe the cloud data clean and claim he was the victim of a sophisticated corporate hack. The rented cargo van crept through the desolate streets of the warehouse district. The area was completely abandoned at this hour, with nothing but flickering orange streetlights illuminating the wet pavement. Julian navigated the labyrinth of heavy chain-link fences and corrugated steel buildings until he found the specific address. It was a massive, imposing warehouse sitting at the very end of a dead-end street isolated from the main industrial thoroughfare. Julian cut the headlights and let the van idle in the darkness, his chest heaving with nervous exhaustion. He told Brianna to stay in the running vehicle while he unlocked the loading dock gates. Julian stepped out into the freezing rain and jogged toward the towering steel gates of the warehouse. He reached into his pocket for the heavy brass keys the third-party landlord had given him, but as he approached the entrance, he suddenly froze. The heavy iron latch he expected to find was completely wrapped in thick industrial-grade steel chains. 3 massive heavy-duty padlocks were secured through the chain links, locking the gate down completely. Julian grabbed the chains and rattled them violently, pulling with all his remaining strength, but the cold steel did not budge a single millimeter. "What is wrong?" Brianna yelled, rolling down the passenger window of the cargo van, her voice shrill with mounting panic. "Someone changed the locks," Julian shouted back, kicking the metal gate in sheer frustration. "This does not make any sense. I paid the lease in full through the holding company. We have to cut these chains right now before the federal agents track my phone location." He turned around to scan the dark street, searching for anything he could use to break the heavy padlocks. That is when the bright, blinding beams of industrial floodlights suddenly snapped on, completely flooding the dead-end street with harsh white light. Julian threw his hands up to shield his eyes, staggering backward against the chained gate. Brianna screamed and ducked down inside the cargo van, terrified that the police had finally cornered them. But there were no police sirens or flashing red and blue lights. Instead, the deep, low rumble of heavy diesel engines echoed through the rain. 3 massive commercial logistics trucks rolled out from the alleyways, effectively blocking the single exit to the dead-end street. The cargo van was completely boxed in. The doors of the lead logistics truck opened with a heavy mechanical hiss. Heavy steel-toed work boots hit the wet pavement, splashing through the puddles. Isaiah stepped out of the shadows wearing his thick canvas jacket and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He was flanked by 6 massive warehouse logistics workers carrying heavy steel crowbars and industrial bolt cutters. Isaiah walked slowly and deliberately toward the locked gate, stopping just a few feet away from where Julian stood shivering and terrified in the rain. Isaiah looked down at the pathetic, wealthy executive who had once mocked his garbage trucks at an elite country club. "You are trespassing on private commercial property, Julian," Isaiah said, his deep, thunderous voice cutting effortlessly through the sound of the falling rain. Julian wiped the cold water from his eyes and tried to stand up straight, attempting to project some fraction of his usual arrogance. "I have a legally binding commercial lease for this specific warehouse," he stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. I rented this property through a verified third-party management group. You cannot legally be here. Isaiah let out a low, rumbling laugh that sent a visible shiver down Julian's spine. He reached inside his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a thick stack of laminated legal documents. You did rent this warehouse through a third-party management group, Julian Isaiah explained, tossing the heavy documents directly onto the wet pavement at Julian's feet. But my commercial logistics empire actually owns the physical deed to this entire industrial block. That third-party management group works directly for me. Julian stared down at the documents, his mind racing as the devastating reality of the trap finally set in. He had unknowingly walked his stolen millions right into the hands of the man he had spent years disrespecting. You also missed your last rental payment, Isaiah continued, crossing his thick arms over his chest. You were so busy embezzling venture capital money to pay for designer dresses that you forgot to fund your own shell company accounts. By state commercial logistics law, unpaid rent allows the property owner to legally seize and hold all assets currently located on the premises. Isaiah took a step closer, his physical presence completely dominating the terrified executive. He looked past Julian toward the idling cargo van where Brianna was cowering in the passenger seat. Those highly secure federal evidence servers sitting in the back of your rented van are now officially seized as collateral for unpaid commercial rent, Isaiah commanded. My boys are going to unload them and lock them safely inside my warehouse. I am sure my daughter Alana and the federal restructuring auditors will be incredibly grateful for the delivery. Thanks for the servers, Julian. The physical evidence servers were locked securely inside my father's heavily guarded commercial warehouse by 2:00 in the morning. My restructuring team wasted absolutely no time getting to work. We set up a secure mobile digital workstation right there on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by towering pallets of imported luxury linens and restaurant supplies. The encrypted digital ledgers that Julian thought he had so cleverly hidden behind layers of fake corporate bureaucracy were cracked open before the sun even started to rise. The level of blatant corporate fraud we uncovered within those hard drives was staggering. But what interested me the most was a secondary offshore routing protocol hidden deep within the primary financial code. I was carefully analyzing this secondary set of international wire transfers when my phone vibrated against the cold metal folding table. It was a text message from a very unexpected sender. The message was from Alicia. She was Julian's older sister and the wife of the incredibly arrogant venture capitalist Connor. She wanted to meet me immediately at an upscale botanical garden cafe on the wealthy north side of the city. I agreed to the meeting because I knew exactly what she was going to attempt to do. I drove across the city as the pale morning sun broke through the heavy winter clouds, casting long shadows over the wet pavement. The cafe was an extravagant glass-enclosed conservatory filled with exotic blooming orchids and expensive wrought-iron furniture. It was the exact kind of pretentious, overly curated environment where women like Alicia felt they held absolute power and control over the narrative. I found her sitting at a secluded table in the back corner, completely surrounded by vibrant purple flowers and hanging vines. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat and oversized designer sunglasses pushed back into her perfectly highlighted blonde hair. She looked the picture of old money elegance, but her hands were gripping her delicate porcelain teacup with a tense, nervous energy that completely betrayed her calm outward facade. Alicia forced a stiff, tight smile as I sat down across from her. She did not bother asking how I was doing or how her niece Zoe was coping with the sudden divorce proceedings. She simply reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick white envelope. She placed her manicured hand flat over the paper and slowly slid it across the glass table until it rested directly in front of me. We need to put an end to this embarrassing madness right now. Alana? Alicia said, her voice strained with a horrible, pathetic attempt at sisterly sympathy. I know you are hurting, but tearing our family apart in public is not the answer for anyone. That envelope contains a certified cashier's check for exactly $100,000. I want you to take it and walk away today. Withdraw the federal audit against the company and let Julian keep the house. You can take the money and start over quietly without causing any more damage. I stared at the white envelope and then looked up into Alicia's desperate, calculating eyes. I did not reach for the money. I did not speak a single word. My absolute silence seemed to unravel whatever manipulative script she had rehearsed in her head. Alicia dropped the friendly, caring sister act and let out a heavy, frustrated sigh, leaning aggressively forward across the small table. "You brought this entire situation on yourself, Alana," she stated, her tone turning incredibly sharp and accusatory. "If you had just been more submissive and focused on keeping your husband happy, Julian never would have strayed. He needed a supportive wife who understood his visionary brilliance, not a bitter corporate workaholic who constantly challenged his authority. You never truly fit into our world, and your refusal to just play your part is destroying everything we built. You cannot ruin my husband's venture capital firm over your own failed marriage. Connor is a good man who trusted your husband with his money. Take the check and do not destroy our family legacy just because you could not keep a man satisfied." I sat perfectly still, letting the vicious, racist, and deeply misogynistic insults hang in the humid air of the greenhouse. Alicia actually believed that my lack of submissiveness was the root cause of Julian's massive federal fraud scheme. She firmly believed that her husband Connor was an innocent, brilliant investor whose pristine reputation was being unfairly dragged through the mud by a bitter ex-wife. She had absolutely no idea how deep the rot in her own perfect marriage truly went. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I did not bother arguing with a woman who was so completely blind to reality. I slowly reached down into my heavy work tote and pulled out a thick black folder containing the raw financial data my team had extracted just hours ago. I used the black folder to push the $100,000 check back across the glass table toward her. "I am not ruining your husband's precious firm, Alicia," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly even. "Your husband is doing a spectacular job of ruining it all by himself." Alicia frowned deeply, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in confusion. She looked down at the black folder and reluctantly opened the cover. Her arrogant posture began to crumble almost immediately as her eyes scanned the highlighted federal banking documents inside. She was looking at a series of massive wire transfers originating from Connor's personal corporate accounts and terminating in a highly secure private bank in Geneva, Switzerland. "You thought Connor was just an innocent victim being played by my husband?" I explained smoothly, watching her breathing become shallow and erratic. "But the physical backup servers my team seized last night tell a much darker story. Connor knew exactly what Julian was doing with the venture capital funds. In fact, Connor helped him set up the embezzlement protocol so he could secretly skim millions of dollars off the top for his own personal use." Alicia let out a shaky, breathless gasp, her manicured fingers trembling violently as she flipped to the second page of the dossier. She saw the ownership documents for the Swiss bank account and the deed to a luxury ski chalet in the French Alps that Connor had recently purchased entirely in cash. "Read the name of the primary beneficiary on that offshore account." "Alicia," I commanded, my tone absolute and unforgiving. "Read the exact name of the woman your husband is hiding his stolen millions with." Alicia stared at the bold printed name on the official banking ledger. It was not her name. It was the name of a 24-year-old white fitness instructor whom Connor had explicitly hired as his private personal trainer last year. The documents proved he was funneling the embezzled money directly into a secret life with his young mistress, completely bypassing his marital assets and leaving Alicia with nothing. Alicia's perfect, affluent world shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there in the Botanical Garden Cafe. She dropped the heavy folder, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as a quiet, devastated sob escaped her throat. I picked up my bag and stood up, leaving her completely alone at the table with her worthless cashier's check and the absolute destruction of her beautiful lie. I walked out of the botanical gardens into the crisp winter air, feeling a profound sense of closure. Alicia had come to buy my silence, but instead she left with the agonizing truth about her own fake reality. But my work was not even close to being finished. Despite the massive federal audit tearing through Julian's company and the inevitable collapse of Connor's venture capital empire, my former mother-in-law Valerie was completely refusing to accept her new reality. She was absolutely determined to maintain her pristine high society image at all costs. By the end of the week, Valerie was moving forward with her prestigious annual winter charity gala. It was the absolute crown jewel of the elite social calendar, and Valerie used it every single year to solidify her status as the reigning queen of their exclusive circle. She had rented out the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive luxury hotel, completely ignoring the fact that her son's corporate assets were currently frozen by the federal government. She believed that if she just threw enough money at a lavish party, everyone would ignore the swirling rumors of federal indictments. She wanted to project an aura of untouchable wealth, but she was building her castle on quicksand. Valerie obviously did not send me an invitation. She fully expected me to be hiding in shame while she paraded around in diamonds, pretending her family was still the elite standard of the city. But she severely underestimated my professional reach and my strategic planning. The primary financial sponsor for the gala was a massive international banking conglomerate. They also happened to be one of the top clients of my restructuring firm. When their regional director heard about my personal connection to the event, he personally invited me to attend as his exclusive VIP guest. I arrived at the grand ballroom wearing a floor-length emerald green silk gown that fit me perfectly. I wore no jewelry and carried a simple black clutch, projecting an image of quiet, absolute power. The moment I stepped through the massive gold-plated double doors, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. Dozens of wealthy socialites and powerful executives turned their heads to stare at me. The whispers rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Everyone in that room knew about the divorce, and everyone knew about the federal audit, but no one expected me to walk right into the lion's den. Valerie was standing near a towering swan ice sculpture in the center of the room, wearing a heavily beaded silver gown and her signature pearl necklace. She was laughing loudly with the mayor's wife when she finally spotted me. I watched the fake smile completely slide off her face. Her eyes widened in absolute unfiltered horror as she realized I was standing right next to the regional director of the bank that funded her entire event. She could not call security to throw me out without heavily offending her biggest donor, so she was forced to just stand there gripping her champagne flute until her knuckles turned stark white. I spent the next 2 hours effortlessly working the room, shaking hands, and securing new corporate clients while Valerie watched me from across the ballroom seething with jealous rage. She was completely trapped in her own party, forced to watch the woman she despised completely dominate her high society peers. Eventually, the string quartet stopped playing and Valerie stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the room. She tapped the microphone and forced a bright artificial smile as the room quieted down. She went through her usual rehearsed speech, thanking the wealthy donors and praising her own immense generosity and charitable spirit. But as she looked down and saw me sitting at the premier VIP table right in the front row, her legendary narcissism completely took over. Her need to assert dominance over me was stronger than her sense of self-preservation. She decided to go entirely off script. She could not resist the urge to try and publicly destroy me in front of the people she valued most. "We are so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by true family and loyal friends tonight," Valerie announced, her voice echoing loudly through the massive speakers. "In times of great success, it is so important to recognize those who stand by us and support our vision. And it is equally important to recognize those who try to tear us down out of bitter jealousy and spite." She stared directly at me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "We all know that there are certain women who simply cannot handle the immense pressure of our elite world. Women who come from nothing and try to destroy successful men just because they lack the grace and sophistication to keep a family together. Some people will even crash a charity event uninvited just to desperately cling to a lifestyle they never truly belonged in." The entire grand ballroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Several wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing nervously between the brightly lit stage and my table. Valerie stood at the podium looking incredibly smug, fully believing she had just successfully humiliated the garbage truck's daughter in front of the entire city. She wanted me to break. She waited for me to stand up and run out of the room in tears, proving to everyone that I was the weak emotional woman she always claimed I was. But I did not run. I did not even frown. I simply leaned back in my chair, smiled directly at her, and calmly raised my crystal champagne glass high into the air. That raised glass was the exact signal they were waiting for. I had made a few very specific phone calls earlier that afternoon. Suddenly, the heavy grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-song, letting their bows drop to their sides. The head chef marched out of the kitchen, followed by dozens of catering staff and waiters. Without saying a single word, the waiters began rapidly pulling the expensive plates of prime rib and lobster right off the tables, right out from under the wealthy guests. The floral decorators marched into the room carrying large bins and immediately started dismantling the towering centerpieces and dragging them away. Valerie gasped loudly, dropping her index cards onto the stage. "What are you doing?" she screamed into the microphone, her voice cracking with sheer panic as a waiter literally took the champagne glass out of her husband's hand. "Stop this immediately. We are in the middle of a prestigious gala." The head of the catering company, a stern man who did not tolerate financial nonsense, walked directly up to the edge of the stage. He did not even bother using a microphone. His voice was loud enough to carry across the completely silent and shocked room. "We are shutting this entire event down, Mrs. Julian," he shouted, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Our corporate office just received an emergency notification from an independent federal auditor. Every single credit card and bank account associated with your name and your son's company has been officially frozen by the federal government. The massive deposit checks you wrote us yesterday afternoon have completely bounced. My staff does not work for free, and we do not serve criminals. Pack it up, everyone, we are leaving." The elite guests began murmuring in absolute shock, watching in real time as Valerie's perfect high society facade crumbled into dust. She stood frozen behind the podium, her face turning a sickly shade of gray, as the decorators literally carried the swan ice sculpture out the back door. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne and watched her entire world end. The absolute destruction of Valerie's precious charity gala sent shockwaves through the entire financial district by the very next morning. Every single wealthy donor and powerful executive who had witnessed her caterers pack up the food and her decorators dismantle the room immediately severed all ties with her family. Julian had completely isolated himself inside his luxury corner office, desperately trying to find a single offshore account that had not been frozen by the federal government. The heavy rain from the night before had finally stopped, but the dark clouds still hung low over the city, perfectly matching the grim reality of his collapsing corporate empire. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring blankly at his computer screen, where red warning banners flashed repeatedly across every single financial dashboard. His phone rang endlessly with calls from furious investors, but he lacked the courage to answer a single one. The heavy wooden door to his office suddenly violently burst open. Brianna stormed into the room, her face pale and her eyes wide with a frantic manic energy. She was no longer wearing her expensive designer clothes or perfectly styled hair. She wore a simple gray trench coat tightly wrapped around her waist, and she carried a large leather travel bag packed to the brim. She slammed the door shut behind her and marched directly up to Julian's desk, slamming her hands down flat against the polished wood. "You lied to me, Julian," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "You told me the Cayman accounts were completely secure and that your ex-wife was just a stupid, bitter woman who could never trace the shell companies. Now my personal bank accounts are completely locked down and federal agents are actively raiding my apartment building right now. I am not going to federal prison for your reckless mistakes." Julian rubbed his temples, looking up at his young mistress with a mixture of absolute exhaustion and deep contempt. "Calm down, Brianna. He ordered, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "We just need to wait for Connor to secure a private legal team. We can still spin this as a corporate misunderstanding if we all just stick to the exact same story." "I am not sticking to any story," Brianna yelled, leaning closer to his face. "Connor is ruined. Your mother is ruined. You do not have a single cent left to your name, and Isaiah sees the only physical backup servers that could have proven our innocence. I want $500,000 in untraceable cash right now, Julian. I know you have a private emergency stash hidden in the floor safe in this office. You are going to give me that money so I can leave the country today, or I am going straight to the Securities and Exchange Commission and telling them absolutely everything." Julian stood up abruptly, his chair crashing backward into the wall. "Are you completely insane?" he shouted back, pointing a shaking finger at her. "If you go to the feds, you will implicate yourself. You are the one who actively forged the executive signatures on the transfer documents. You are the one who physically registered the shell company under your own name. We are in this exact same sinking boat, Brianna. I will tell them you forced me to do it," she sneered, her voice dripping with pure malice. "I will tell the federal investigators that you used your immense power as a chief executive officer to coerce a young vulnerable employee into signing those documents. They will absolutely believe me over a corrupt venture capitalist who just had his entire company seized and his assets frozen. Give me the $500,000, Julian, or I will personally make sure you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your pathetic life." I stood quietly in this doorway, leaning against the heavy wooden frame, letting their vicious screaming match wash over me. I had quietly slipped into the executive suite using my unrestricted federal audit clearance. I held my silver smartphone casually in my right hand with the screen glowing brightly to indicate the high-definition audio recording application was actively running. They were so completely consumed by their own greedy panic that they did not even notice me standing there documenting every single incriminating word they screamed at each other. "That is a fascinating legal strategy, Brianna," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, cutting through their chaotic shouting. I slowly stepped into the spacious office and held up my glowing phone, letting them clearly see the red recording timer ticking upward. "But I am afraid your timeline of events is going to be incredibly difficult to prove in a federal court." Both Julian and Brianna spun around to face me. Julian looked like he was going to be physically sick. He grabbed the edge of his mahogany desk, gripping it until his knuckles turned completely white. Brianna took a step back away from him, her eyes darting between me and the glowing recording device in my hand. Her arrogant, demanding posture completely dissolved into absolute terror. "You cannot use that recording," Brianna stammered, her voice shaking violently as she desperately tried to change her entire strategy. "It does not matter anyway, Alana. I will just tell the federal prosecutors that you are the one who masterminded this entire financial scheme. I will tell them you secretly forced me to set up the Cayman accounts to destroy your husband during your bitter divorce. You have the technical skills to pull it off, and they will absolutely believe you used me as a pawn." I looked at the terrified young woman and let out a slow, genuine laugh. "You really do not understand how federal investigations work. Do you, Brianna?" I asked, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "You see, the Securities and Exchange Commission already has a cooperating witness. I personally arranged a meeting late last night and granted full federal immunity to your junior assistant, Chloe." Brianna's jaw dropped open, and the remaining color completely drained from her face. "Chloe kept meticulous backup records of every single time you ordered her to forge a signature or alter a financial document," I explained smoothly, my voice cold and absolute. "She handed over all of your private emails, your hidden encrypted files, and the exact timeline of your offshore transfers. She gave the federal agents absolutely everything they needed to build a concrete case directly against you. You are not getting $500,000, and you are definitely not leaving the country. You are facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary, Brianna, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." The fallout from Judge Harrison issuing that severe court order was immediate and completely catastrophic. Before Julian even made it out of the courthouse parking lot, the news of the mandatory forensic audit had reached the board of directors at his financial technology company. The board was already operating in a state of sheer panic because the Securities and Exchange Commission had quietly frozen several of their primary operating accounts early that morning. My anonymous tip to the federal investigators had triggered an automated lockdown on all offshore transfers. By the time Julian arrived at his glass and steel corporate headquarters in Midtown, the board had convened an emergency meeting. Corporate bylaws and strict federal regulations dictated their next move. To prevent a complete freeze of all corporate assets and avoid immediate federal indictment, the board was legally required to bring in an independent restructuring firm. This firm would have absolute authority to audit every single ledger, bypass executive passwords, and seize all digital hardware. They needed a firm with top-tier federal clearance, and they needed it before the markets opened the following day. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the top-floor boardroom was incredibly tense. I stood outside the heavy frosted glass doors, listening to the muffled sounds of an intense argument. Connor was pacing back and forth, furiously berating Julian. Even through the thick glass, I could hear the absolute rage in Connor's voice as he realized his $10 million venture capital investment was tied up in a massive federal fraud investigation. Julian sat at the massive marble table looking completely defeated. His expensive designer suit looked rumpled and his perfectly styled hair was a mess. He kept checking his phone, desperately hoping his lawyers could find a loophole to block the audit. Sitting quietly in the corner was Brianna. She was nervously chewing on her perfectly manicured nails and clutching her oversized designer tote bag tightly against her chest. They were all waiting for the lead auditor from the appointed restructuring firm to arrive. They desperately hoped they could intimidate or manipulate whoever walked through those doors, just like they manipulated everyone else in their elite social circle. I adjusted the collar of my sharp black suit and pushed the heavy glass doors open. The heavy thud of the doors swinging shut echoed through the massive boardroom. The arguing instantly stopped. Connor spun around his face, turning bright red as his eyes locked onto mine. Julian physically recoiled in his leather chair as if he had just seen a ghost. Brianna let out a small, sharp gasp and sank deeper into her corner seat, gripping her bag even tighter. "What the hell are you doing here?" Connor exploded, slamming his hands down on the marble table. "This is a closed corporate meeting for executive board members only. Security is going to drag you out of this building, Alana." I did not flinch or break my steady stride. I walked directly to the head of the marble table and placed my heavy leather briefcase down. "I am exactly where I'm supposed to be, Connor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and authoritative. Julian jumped out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is an absolute conflict of interest," Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are my estranged wife. You are actively suing me in family court. You cannot possibly be the independent auditor. I am calling my legal team right now to have this entire process thrown out." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents bound with a heavy blue federal seal. I tossed the stack onto the center of the table, letting it slide perfectly until it hit Julian's shaking hands. "You can call whoever you want?" "Julian," I replied smoothly. "But you might want to read the federal mandate first. My restructuring firm is the only agency in this specific financial sector currently authorized by the Securities and Exchange Commission to handle an embezzlement case of this massive magnitude." The federal judge reviewed the conflict of interest claim this morning and officially waived it because the evidence of offshore fraud was so overwhelming. "I am operating under a direct federal court order." Connor stared at the blue seal on the documents, his arrogant demeanor completely collapsing. He realized in that exact moment that all his elite country club connections and generational wealth could not protect him from a federal investigation. He was trapped in a room with the very woman he had threatened just days ago, and now she held his entire financial future in the palm of her hand. "Sit down, gentlemen," I commanded, my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "This audit begins right now. You are legally required to hand over your company laptops, your corporate phones, and all access tokens. Failure to comply will result in immediate federal obstruction charges." Julian sank back into his chair, his face completely pale as he stared at the federal mandate. He slowly pushed his silver laptop across the smooth marble table. Connor clenched his jaw in pure rage, but he silently surrendered his devices, knowing he had absolutely no other choice. His massive ego was finally entirely crushed under the weight of his own terrible business decisions. As I began logging their devices into my secure inventory system, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. Brianna had quietly stood up from her chair. Her face was covered in a cold sweat, and her eyes were darting nervously toward the boardroom exit. She thought all the attention was focused on Julian and Connor. She slowly slung her heavy designer tote bag over her shoulder and began inching toward the frosted glass doors, trying to slip out completely unnoticed. I saw the distinct rectangular bulge pressing against the soft leather of her bag. It was a high-capacity external hard drive, the exact hard drive Julian used to authorize the offshore transfers to her Cayman Islands shell company. She was carrying the most crucial piece of evidence right out of the room. "Going somewhere, Brianna?" I asked without looking up from my inventory sheet. She froze in her tracks, her hand hovering just inches from the door handle. "I just need to use the restroom," Brianna stammered, her voice trembling with panic. "I am not an employee here, so I do not need to surrender anything." She violently shoved the heavy glass door open and sprinted down the carpeted hallway toward the private executive elevators. She frantically mashed the call button, looking back over her shoulder with sheer terror in her eyes. She thought she was going to escape with the only physical evidence that directly tied her to the stolen venture capital funds. She actually believed she could outsmart a federal audit by simply walking away. I casually picked up my phone and pressed a single button connecting directly to the building security desk. "Yes, this is the lead federal auditor," I said, watching Brianna through the glass walls as the elevator doors slowly began to open. "There is a woman in a beige dress attempting to board the executive elevator. Do not let those doors close. Confiscate her designer bag immediately." Brianna stepped into the elevator thinking she had won. But before the metal doors could slide shut, two massive security guards stepped directly into the frame, blocking her exit entirely. I watched from the boardroom as the security guards easily overpowered her frantic attempts to hold on to the bag. Brianna collapsed against the elevator wall, sobbing uncontrollably as my restructuring team arrived on the floor to secure the stolen hard drive into a tamper-proof federal evidence bag. The look of utter defeat on Julian and Connor's faces was something I would savor for the rest of my life. They were completely stripped of their power, their wealth, and their arrogant delusions. The federal audit had officially begun, and I was going to tear their fraudulent empire apart piece by piece. After utterly destroying Connor's arrogant savior complex in my office, I did not have time to sit back and relax. I immediately gathered my heavy winter coat and drove my car out toward the wealthy eastern suburbs of the city. Julian and Valerie had been living in an incredibly lavish, sprawling stone estate that Julian had purchased 2 years ago, just to show off his new executive wealth. He had moved Brianna right in after the divorce proceedings, started letting her redecorate the entire master wing with ridiculously expensive imported Italian furniture and custom luxury fixtures. But what none of them realized was that Julian had secretly leveraged the entire estate as collateral to secure the fraudulent bridge loans for his failing company. And since my holding firm had quietly purchased all of that toxic debt earlier this month, I was now the sole legal owner of the property. I pulled my car up to the curb and watched with immense satisfaction as 3 massive commercial moving trucks sat idling in the wide circular driveway. I had hired a premium estate liquidation crew to completely empty the house from top to bottom. They were working with incredible efficiency, taking apart the massive home room by room. I stood on the pristine front lawn watching as a team of 4 men carefully carried out Valerie's precious antique Victorian chaise lounge. Another crew was rolling out heavy wardrobe boxes filled with Brianna's expensive designer clothes, imported silk shoes, and limited edition handbags. Everything they had bought with stolen money was being systematically packed away to be auctioned off to satisfy the massive corporate debt they owed me. I watched the heavy crystal chandeliers being loaded into padded crates, feeling a profound sense of absolute justice. About 30 minutes later, A black ride-share vehicle pulled slowly into the driveway, stopping just behind the largest moving truck. Julian and Brianna climbed out of the back seat, looking absolutely battered and exhausted from the disastrous morning they had just survived at the corporate office. Julian was rubbing his face with his hands, his expensive tailored suit wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he looked up and saw the moving trucks blocking his front door. Brianna let out a loud, piercing shriek and dropped her heavy leather tote bag onto the wet pavement. She pointed a shaking finger at a mover who was carrying out her custom-mirrored vanity desk and her collection of expensive imported perfumes. "What are you doing?" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic as he sprinted across the perfectly manicured lawn. "Put my mother's furniture down right now. Who authorized this? You are trespassing on private property and stealing our personal belongings." The moving foreman, a large muscular man with absolutely no patience for wealthy temper tantrums, simply ignored Julian and continued directing his busy crew. Brianna ran up to the front steps, trying to physically block the doorway with her arms stretched wide. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming that her entire life was being stolen by common thugs and demanding that they leave her expensive clothes alone. Julian frantically dug into his pockets and pulled out his cell phone, dialing emergency services with shaking fingers. He paced back and forth across the driveway, loudly demanding that the police send multiple units immediately to stop an active robbery at his luxury estate. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 local police cruisers came speeding around the corner with their sirens blaring and their lights flashing brightly in the overcast afternoon air. They pulled into the driveway, and 4 uniformed officers stepped out, resting their hands cautiously on their duty belts. Julian immediately rushed up to the closest officer, pointing aggressively at the moving crew and demanding that they all be arrested on the spot. He put on his best arrogant executive voice, trying to play the role of the wealthy, powerful victim whose beautiful castle was being illegally invaded by criminals. "Officer, you need to draw your weapons and stop these thieves," Julian shouted, his face red and slick with cold sweat. "They have broken into my home and are actively stealing millions of dollars worth of my family personal assets. I demand that you arrest every single one of them right now before they destroy my property." I decided that they had suffered enough confusion for one afternoon. I slowly walked out through the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped onto the wide stone porch overlooking the driveway. I held a pristine manila folder in my hands and looked down at Julian and Brianna with a calm, chilling smile. "Nobody is getting arrested for doing their job today, Julian," I announced, my voice carrying easily over the low rumble of the idling trucks and the quiet hum of the police cruisers. Julian's jaw dropped open, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Brianna's dropped bag. "You?" he whispered, his eyes wide with absolute horror as he stared up at the porch. "What are you doing inside my house, Alana?" I calmly walked down the stone steps and handed the open folder directly to the lead police officer. I gave the officer a polite nod as he began reading over the heavy stack of legally binding documents. "It is not your house, Julian," I explained, my tone perfectly, even and completely relaxed. "Since you recklessly used this entire estate as collateral for the fraudulent corporate loans, and my holding company now legally owns every single cent of that toxic debt, I have officially foreclosed on the property." Brianna let out a loud, choked sob, covering her face with her trembling hands as she realized her luxurious lifestyle was truly over. Julian shook his head violently, refusing to accept the harsh reality of his situation. "You cannot just take my home," Julian yelled, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "There is a legal process for foreclosure. You have to give us formal notice. You cannot just throw us out into the street without any warning." I smiled sharply, looking him directly in his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "I gave you a standard 30 days notice of eviction, Julian," I replied smoothly, keeping my posture tall and unbothered. "The certified letters were delivered directly to your corporate office and to this address multiple times over the past month. You were just entirely too busy panicking over the federal audit and screaming at your mistress to bother reading your own legal mail. I legally own the deed to this land and everything inside of it." The lead police officer closed the manila folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned to face Julian and his expression immediately hardened. He reached toward his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of thick white paper. "She is completely right, Mr. Julian," the officer stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. "The foreclosure documents are entirely in order, and this is a perfectly legal eviction. But that is actually not the reason we were dispatched to this address today." Julian froze, his eyes darting nervously between the officer's serious face and the white paper in his hand. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the reality of his total destruction finally catching up to him. "What do you mean?" Julian stammered, taking another slow step backward toward the street. The officer stepped forward and unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his black leather duty belt. "Julian, we have just received a direct federal warrant for your immediate arrest for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement," the officer said, his stern voice echoing across the empty driveway. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Julian was shoved roughly against the cold metal door of the police cruiser, his hands firmly locked in heavy steel cuffs behind his back. I stood on the pristine stone porch of my newly acquired estate and watched with absolute cold satisfaction as the officers patted down his expensive tailored suit. Brianna was still screaming hysterically on the driveway, clutching her empty designer handbag, but Julian did not even look at her. He was staring at me through the window of the police car, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and utter terror as the reality of his total destruction finally set in. The cruiser pulled away down the long, winding driveway, leaving nothing but the sound of the moving trucks continuing to empty the house that used to be his sanctuary. Later that evening, the arrogant corporate executive who thought he owned the entire financial district was sitting on a hard metal bench inside a freezing concrete holding cell. The heavy steel door had slammed shut, echoing down the sterile cinderblock hallway of the federal precinct. Julian had spent his entire life insulated by generational wealth and powerful country club connections, but none of those things existed in this damp, windowless room. The federal agents had stripped him of his expensive silk tie, his shoelaces, and his solid gold watch, leaving him sitting under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, completely stripped of his precious dignity. When the guards finally permitted him his single legally mandated phone call, Julian did not hesitate. He confidently dialed the private number to his mother Valerie's sprawling penthouse estate. He fully expected Valerie to answer immediately and assure him that she was already wiring millions of dollars to the best defense attorneys in the country. He expected her to fix this mess, just like she had fixed every single one of his arrogant mistakes since he was a child. But instead of his mother's comforting voice, Julian heard the sharp automated tone of the phone company. The robotic voice coldly informed him that the number he was trying to reach had been completely disconnected. He stood there holding the heavy plastic receiver against his ear, his hand shaking violently. Valerie was officially broke. The federal authorities had completely frozen all of her accounts, seized her properties, and shut down her entire life, just as quickly as they had dismantled his. There was no secret emergency fund. There was no army of high-priced lawyers rushing to bail him out. He was completely and utterly alone. In a state of absolute blind panic, he used a favor from a sympathetic public defender to send a desperate message to my private restructuring firm, begging me to come down to the federal precinct. I drove across the city as the heavy winter night settled over the skyline. The precinct was a depressing maze of scuffed linoleum floors and harsh flickering lights that smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. I walked past the busy booking desks wearing a perfectly tailored black wool coat, my heels clicking sharply against the floor with absolute authority. I was led down a long, narrow corridor into a bleak visitation room divided entirely by a thick wall of reinforced bulletproof glass. Julian was brought into the opposite side of the room a few minutes later. He looked absolutely pathetic. He was already wearing a bright orange institutional jumpsuit that hung loosely over his slumped shoulders. His perfectly styled hair was a greasy mess clinging to his forehead, and dark purple shadows hung heavily under his exhausted eyes. He sat down heavily on the metal stool across from me and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver attached to the wall. I took my time slowly sitting down and picking up the receiver on my side of the glass. I did not speak a single word. I simply looked at him, waiting for him to make his final desperate move. Julian tried to force a small, familiar smile, but it looked like a painful grimace on his battered face. He leaned close to the scratched glass, pressing his hand against the reinforced pane, as if he could somehow reach through and manipulate me like he always used to do. "We have a daughter," Alana, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking with a pathetic attempt at raw emotion. "We can stop all of this madness right now. You are the only one who has the power to pull the federal auditors back. Do you really want her father spending the next decade of his life wearing a jumpsuit? We can rebuild everything we lost. I will do whatever you want. We can be a family again." I sat perfectly still, listening to the hollow, desperate words tumbling out of his mouth. Even now, sitting in a federal holding cell facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, he was still trying to gaslight me. He genuinely believed he could use our innocent daughter as a pawn to manipulate my maternal instincts and save his own worthless skin. He thought I was still the quiet, submissive wife who would sacrifice her own sanity just to keep his image perfectly intact. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sympathy for the broken man sitting on the other side of the glass. I reached down into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally binding document bound in heavy black cardstock. I slowly slid the heavy document through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the security glass until it rested directly in front of his shaking hands. Julian stared down at the paperwork, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "That is a finalized federal plea agreement, Julian." I stated, my voice radiating absolute unyielding power. "It also includes a total and permanent termination of all your parental rights regarding Zoe. Sign away all parental rights and I will recommend a minimum security prison. Fight me and I will hand over the remaining offshore files that will get you 20 years. Julian recoiled as if the paper had physically burned him. The remaining fight completely drained out of his body in a single agonizing second. He looked down at the thick document and then back up at my cold, unwavering expression. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew I held the absolute power to dictate the rest of his miserable life. Slowly, his shoulders began to violently shake as a heavy, broken sob tore through his throat. He picked up the cheap plastic pen resting on the metal counter, and with tears streaming down his face, he signed his name, completely erasing himself from our lives forever. I slid the heavy reinforced glass slot shut and took the signed plea agreement from the cold metal counter. Julian collapsed completely, burying his face in his hands as loud, pathetic sobs echoed through the sterile holding cell. I did not look back at him. I placed the document safely inside my leather briefcase and walked out of the federal precinct, breathing in the crisp, freezing night air. Julian was finally neutralized, but the night was far from over. There was still one massive, arrogant, loose end, tying this entire fraudulent financial empire together. Connor had spent the last 3 years funneling dirty venture capital through Julian's shell companies, and he knew the federal auditors were already ripping his personal ledgers apart. He was not going to sit around and wait for the feds to knock on his massive mahogany front door. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket as I started my engine. It was a secure, encrypted message from Isaiah. My brilliant logistics director had been tracking Connor's movements through our quiet network of informants and digital surveillance ever since the boardroom audit began. Isaiah sent me a real-time tracking link showing Connor's black luxury SUV speeding frantically down the interstate, heading directly toward the private executive airfield on the desolate outskirts of the city. Connor was attempting to completely flee the country before the Securities and Exchange Commission could officially freeze his primary offshore accounts. He had chartered a private jet, claiming he had an emergency business meeting in a non-extradition territory where he could safely hide his stolen millions. I smiled sharply, putting my car into gear and speeding onto the empty highway. I was not going to the airfield alone. I had made a very important phone call earlier that afternoon to the one person who hated Connor even more than I did. I pulled my car through the secure chain-link gates of the private aviation terminal just as the heavy winter winds began whipping across the dark tarmac. Parked near a sleek white Gulfstream jet was a silver sedan. Alicia stepped out of the driver's side, wrapping her thick wool coat tightly around her shoulders to ward off the biting cold. Connor's beautiful high society wife looked absolutely furious and completely radiant. For years, Connor had treated her like a foolish, ignorant trophy wife, parading her around at elite charity galas, while secretly draining her generational trust fund to finance his incredibly illegal offshore investments. When I showed Alicia the hidden financial documents proving Connor was preparing to leave her completely bankrupt and stranded with his massive corporate debts, she instantly became my most valuable ally. We stood together on the freezing concrete, waiting in total silence as Connor's speeding SUV finally tore onto the runway with its headlights cutting through the darkness. The black vehicle slammed on its brakes, skidding slightly on the icy tarmac right next to the waiting jet. Connor threw the driver's side door open and scrambled out, clutching a heavy aluminum briefcase packed tight with liquid assets and bearer bonds. His arrogant, confident swagger was entirely gone. He looked like a cornered rat, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He froze in his tracks the exact moment he saw Alicia and me blocking his path to the metal boarding stairs. His eyes darted wildly between my calm expression and his wife's cold, furious stare. "What the hell are you doing here?" Connor demanded, his voice trembling violently as he clutched his silver briefcase against his chest. "Alicia, get out of my way right now. I have to leave the country immediately for an emergency board meeting, and I do not have time for your typical dramatic nonsense." Alicia did not flinch or take a single step back from her cowardly husband. She reached into her designer coat and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. She casually tossed the heavy paperwork directly at his chest, letting the pages scatter across the freezing wet concrete right at his expensive leather shoes. "There is no emergency board meeting, Connor," Alicia stated, her voice dripping with absolute venom and total disgust. "Those are immediate emergency divorce papers, combined with a strict federal injunction, totally freezing every single one of your domestic and international assets. I know exactly what you did with my trust fund, and you are not getting on that plane tonight or any other night." Connor looked down at the scattered legal papers, his entire face turning a deep shade of purple with uncontrollable, violent rage. "You stupid, ungrateful women," he screamed, taking a threatening step toward us with his fists clenched tight. "You think a few pieces of paper are going to stop me? I am a billionaire venture capitalist, and neither of you have the power to keep me in this country. I will destroy both of your lives the second I land in Europe." He was so busy screaming and waving his arms that he completely failed to notice the massive convoy of dark armored vehicles speeding silently onto the runway from the opposite end of the airfield. Isaiah had not just sent the flight path tracking data to me. He had anonymously forwarded every single byte of Connor's frantic travel logs and offshore transfer attempts directly to the lead director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The armored vehicles violently swerved to a halt, surrounding the private jet in a perfectly orchestrated tactical blockade. A dozen heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, shouting absolute commands over the roaring winter wind. Red and blue lights flashed brightly against the white hull of the aircraft, illuminating the absolute terror spreading across Connor's face. He dropped his silver briefcase in pure shock as the heavy latches burst open, scattering hundreds of illegal bearer bonds across the windy tarmac like worthless scraps of trash. "Get down on the ground right now," an agent roared, grabbing Connor by his expensive tailored jacket and violently forcing him face down onto the freezing wet concrete. The mighty, arrogant venture capitalist who had threatened to ruin my life just days ago was now pressing his cheek against the icy runway, sobbing pathetically as heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. He whined and pleaded, begging the agents to let him call his private lawyers, but they simply hauled him roughly to his feet and shoved him toward a waiting transport van. Alicia and I stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in our warm coats, watching with immense quiet satisfaction as the federal agents dragged the ruined, crying billionaire away into the dark winter night. The empire was finally completely broken, and we were the ones left standing in the wreckage. The relentless winter rain pounded heavily against the massive steel roof of the regional trucking headquarters my father had built from the ground up. The sprawling industrial complex was a loud, chaotic symphony of roaring diesel engines, heavy machinery, and constant movement. It was a place of rough, calloused hands and genuine hard work, a place that represented everything my former mother-in-law absolutely despised. For years, Valerie had turned her delicate nose up at my father's business, loudly mocking his blue-collar roots to her elite country club friends and sneering at the honest labor that had funded my pristine childhood. She had always firmly believed that her generational status and her inherited last name made her inherently superior to a man who wore steel-toed boots to work. But as a cheap yellow taxi pulled slowly into the muddy gravel parking lot that afternoon, the strict social hierarchy Valerie had worshipped her entire life was officially dead and buried. The federal indictments against Julian and the total seizure of her fraudulent estate had left her completely destitute. Her prestigious friends had instantly blocked her phone number the moment the scandal hit the evening news. The exclusive social clubs had formally revoked her memberships, and the bank had mercilessly frozen every single one of her hidden accounts. She had absolutely nowhere left to go, and nobody left to manipulate. The massive, sprawling network of elite favors and quiet bribes that had protected her family for generations had completely evaporated overnight, leaving her entirely powerless. Valerie stepped out of the back of the rusted taxi, and her expensive designer heels immediately sank deep into the wet industrial gravel. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The proud, arrogant matriarch who used to command every room she entered was completely gone. Her normally flawless, highlighted hair was plastered flat against her pale face by the freezing rain. She was not wearing her signature pearl necklace or her custom-tailored cashmere coat. Instead, she was huddled inside a plain, thin raincoat that offered absolutely no protection from the biting winter wind. She looked small, fragile, and utterly desperate as she stumbled awkwardly across the busy shipping yard. Several burly mechanics and dispatchers paused their work to stare at the frantic, soaking wet woman pushing her way through the heavy glass doors of the main logistics office. Valerie stood in the center of the bustling room, dripping dirty rainwater onto the clean linoleum floor. Her chest heaved as she looked around wildly with her dark mascara running in messy streaks down her hollow cheeks. "I demand to see Isaiah!" she shouted, her voice cracking as she tried desperately to summon her old commanding tone. "Tell him Valerie is here and I am not leaving this building until he speaks to me." The busy dispatch room fell completely silent as the heavy wooden door to the executive suite slowly opened. My father stepped out into the hallway holding a stack of shipping manifests in his large, weathered hands. He was wearing a simple faded flannel shirt and heavy denim work pants, projecting the quiet, immovable strength of a man who had survived decades of brutal industry challenges. He did not look surprised to see her standing there looking like a drowned rat in the middle of his dispatch floor. He simply stopped and stared at her with an expression of profound pity mixed with absolute disgust. "Isaiah!" Valerie gasped, stumbling forward and reaching her shaking hands out toward him. "You have to stop her. You have to talk some sense into Alana right now. She is completely out of control and she is destroying my entire family." My father did not move a single muscle. He did not invite her into his private office or offer her a warm towel. He simply looked down at her standing in the mud she had tracked across his clean floor. "She took my home." "Isaiah," Valerie sobbed, her voice echoing pathetically in the silent room. "She sent federal agents to arrest my son, and she froze every single dollar I have to my name. I have absolutely nothing left. The banks are taking my properties and my friends are treating me like a criminal. You need to control your daughter and force her to show us some mercy before we are entirely ruined." Valerie stood there trembling in the cold drafts of the shipping warehouse, expecting my father to bow to her distress, just like all the weak men she had manipulated throughout her privileged life. She genuinely thought he would feel intimidated by her presence and force me to drop the corporate foreclosures. She was still entirely trapped in her delusional reality, where she dictated the rules of the world. My father slowly placed his shipping manifests down on a nearby metal desk. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell or lose his temper. His tone was terrifyingly calm and steady, carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. You spent the last 10 years looking down your nose at my calloused hands, Valerie, my father said softly, his deep voice cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. You sat at our dinner table and mocked my business because it was not elegant enough for your high society friends. You thought because you inherited a fancy last name that you were somehow better than the people who actually built this country. Valerie opened her mouth to argue, but the sheer intensity in his dark eyes forced her to step back in pure fear. But my hands built a real legacy. My father continued taking one slow, deliberate step toward her. I built an empire out of sweat and honesty, and I raised a daughter with a spine made of solid steel. Your hands only built an illusion, Valerie. You raised a weak, cowardly son who had to steal from innocent people just to pretend he was successful. You built a fake kingdom out of lies, and now you are angry because my daughter simply turned on the lights and showed everyone the truth. Valerie let out a broken, ragged gasp, wrapping her thin arms around her shivering body. She looked around the room, hoping to find a single sympathetic face among the dispatchers and mechanics, but they were all staring at her with total contempt. Alana is exactly the woman I raised her to be, my father stated, his voice echoing with fierce, unquestionable pride. She does not need to be controlled, and she is certainly not going to show mercy to a family of parasites who tried to destroy her. You came to the wrong place looking for a savior, Valerie. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence with a simple wave of his hand. Get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing, he commanded without looking back. Valerie stood paralyzed in the center of the room, her final desperate hope entirely shattered. The absolute humiliation of being cast out by a man she had spent her entire life mocking finally broke the last fragile piece of her massive ego. She turned around blindly, pushing through the heavy glass doors and stumbling back out into the freezing, relentless downpour. The heavy warehouse doors swung shut behind her, locking her out of the warmth and leaving her to walk alone into the cold, bitter reality of her total destruction. The storm raged on around her, soaking her through to the bone as she trudged slowly down the long gravel driveway. There was no waiting luxury sedan to whisk her away to a warm penthouse. There was no sympathetic ear waiting to hear her fabricated sob stories. The crushing weight of the rain felt like the physical manifestation of her ruined legacy, pressing down on her shoulders until she could barely stand straight. She had spent her entire existence constructing an impenetrable fortress of wealth and status, only to watch it crumble into dust in a matter of days. My father stood quietly at the window of his office, watching her retreating figure shrink into the stormy distance, knowing that the arrogant empire of Valerie and Julian was finally gone forever. With Connor and Julian both locked away in federal holding cells, my focus shifted to the very last remaining rat frantically trying to scurry off our sinking ship. Brianna had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Her luxury estate had been completely seized, and her offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were entirely frozen by the federal investigators. She was entirely broke and desperate for any possible way to salvage her ruined reputation. She knew she was facing potential criminal charges for her role in the massive embezzlement scheme. Instead of hiring a cheap public defender and accepting her inevitable fate, Brianna decided to play the only card she had left. She reached out to a notorious sleazy tabloid podcast called The Daily Truth. The show was famous for paying massive sums of cash for exclusive, scandalous interviews, and Brianna eagerly signed a contract to broadcast her lies to an audience of millions. She desperately needed that cash to hire a decent criminal defense attorney. She thought she could easily manipulate public opinion and spin a tragic narrative that would force the federal prosecutors to treat her with sympathy and leniency. She truly believed she was smart enough to outwit a federal investigation simply by crying on camera. The live broadcast began on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. Brianna sat in the sleek, modern recording studio, wearing a modest beige sweater and absolutely minimal makeup. She had deliberately styled her hair, to look messy and unkempt, playing the role of a terrified, exhausted victim who had been dragged through hell. She sat across from the aggressive podcast host, staring deeply into the high-definition cameras as the red recording light blinked on, indicating they were streaming live to the world. For the first 45 minutes of the live interview, Brianna put on the absolute performance of a lifetime. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced fake tears to roll down her pale cheeks while her voice trembled with perfectly manufactured fear. She completely threw Julian under the bus, claiming he was a predatory older man who used his extreme wealth and corporate power to manipulate her into a relationship. She told the host that she was just a young, naive girl who had absolutely no idea where the venture capital money was actually coming from. She claimed Julian forced her to sign those offshore banking documents under extreme duress, threatening to ruin her career if she refused to comply with his demands. But Brianna did not stop at throwing Julian to the wolves. She decided to completely fabricate a vicious narrative about me to make her story even more sensational. She leaned close to the studio microphone and told the massive live audience that Alana was a cruel, bitter, and highly vindictive woman. She claimed that I had deliberately orchestrated the entire financial collapse just to punish her for falling in love with my husband. She confidently stated that I had fabricated all the digital evidence and framed her for the corporate embezzlement out of pure, petty jealousy. She sobbed dramatically into a tissue, begging the public to believe that she was entirely innocent and that she was the true victim of this entire scandal. She painted herself as a helpless martyr who was being ruthlessly hunted down by a jealous, wealthy ex-wife with too much power. The podcast host ate up every single word, leaning forward and eagerly encouraging her to share more damaging lies and salacious details. They were both completely oblivious to the massive legal trap that was about to violently snap shut around them. I was sitting perfectly comfortable in my warm corner office, watching the live video feed of the podcast on my large computer monitor. My lead attorney was sitting right across from my desk with a very satisfied smile on his face. We had anticipated this exact desperate move from Brianna days ago. She was far too narcissistic to remain quiet, and we knew she would eventually attempt to sell a fabricated story to the media to save herself. The moment she uttered my name and falsely accused me of framing her for a federal crime, my legal team immediately filed the extensive paperwork we had already prepared. We had a judge standing by who was already deeply familiar with the massive scale of the fraud Julian and Brianna had committed. The judge signed the emergency orders without a single second of hesitation. Back in the recording studio, Brianna was just beginning to describe how terrified she was of my supposed wrath when the heavy soundproof door suddenly swung open. The executive producer of the podcast rushed into the room, looking absolutely panicked and completely out of breath. He completely ignored the fact that they were broadcasting live to millions of avid listeners. He marched directly up to the host and slammed a thick stack of legal documents down onto the black recording desk. The host looked incredibly annoyed at the interruption, but his arrogant expression completely vanished the second he read the bold red lettering on the very first page. The color completely drained from his face, and he began to stammer nervously into his expensive microphone, his hands visibly shaking as he flipped through the heavy pages of the legal notice. Brianna stared at the host in total confusion, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. She asked him what was wrong, but the host completely ignored her. He looked directly into the live camera and frantically announced that they had to immediately terminate the broadcast. He explained in a shaking voice that the network had just been served with a massive multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit filed directly by my legal team. The lawsuit specifically targeted the podcast network, the host and Brianna, for actively broadcasting malicious and entirely fabricated lies to the public. But the absolute worst part for Brianna was the immediate emergency gag order attached to the lawsuit. The host read the legal warning out loud, confirming that a federal judge had already signed the strict injunction legally, forbidding Brianna from speaking about me, Julian, or the ongoing corporate investigation on any public platform ever again. The host angrily reached across the table and shoved the legal documents toward Brianna, treating her like she was carrying a deadly disease. He told her she was a massive financial liability and furiously ordered the producers to cut the live video feed immediately. Brianna sat frozen in her expensive leather chair, staring down at the harsh legal reality of her grim situation. The cameras were still rolling for a few final seconds, capturing the exact moment her entire world completely collapsed in real time. The thick legal documents outlined severe financial penalties for every single lie she had just uttered on the broadcast. She suddenly realized that the large cash payout she was promised for this interview would instantly be seized by my legal team to satisfy the defamation damages. She was not getting a single cent to pay for her criminal defense. Brianna looked around the chaotic studio as the producers frantically tore off their headsets and shouted at each other in pure panic. She was entirely alone and completely exposed. Her desperate attempt to manipulate the public had backfired in the most catastrophic way possible. She knew that this extreme public humiliation combined with the pending federal embezzlement charges meant her life was permanently over. She realized with crushing clarity that she was completely destroyed. No legitimate corporate sector would ever hire a woman who was globally known as a manipulative fraud and a proven liar. No bank would ever approve a loan for her, and no respectable landlord would ever sign a lease with her name on it. She could never work in finance, design, or administration ever again. Her name was entirely toxic in every professional circle. The heavy studio doors closed, leaving her sitting alone in the absolute silence of her total destruction. She had tried to play the role of the innocent victim, but she had finally met a woman who simply refused to lose. 3 months passed since the night the federal agents swarmed the freezing tarmac, and Brianna's desperate podcast interview ended in absolute catastrophic failure. The relentless, brutal winter storms that had mirrored our chaotic lives finally gave way to a bright, crisp spring. The massive legal machine had moved with terrifying efficiency, completely crushing the last remaining fragments of their fraudulent financial empire. The federal courts officially concluded the extensive embezzlement proceedings, firmly wrapping up the massive corporate scandal that had entirely dominated the global news cycle for months. The dust had finally settled over the shattered remains of the old regime, and the absolute reality of their new lives was incredibly grim. Brianna was no longer wearing stolen designer clothes or sipping expensive imported lattes in sleek corner offices. The federal gag order and the massive defamation judgments had completely bankrupted her. She was now working a minimum wage retail job at a depressing discount outlet in a dying strip mall. Her former glamorous existence was nothing but a painful, distant memory. She spent her long, exhausting days folding cheap synthetic sweaters and standing under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, constantly avoiding eye contact with any customer who might recognize her from her viral tabloid humiliation. Her grand illusions of becoming a wealthy, high-society wife had evaporated, leaving her completely trapped in a miserable, ordinary life she used to openly mock. Valerie, the arrogant, untouchable matriarch who once ruthlessly ruled the elite country club, was now completely erased from high society. Her sprawling estate and all of her hidden domestic accounts had been seized by the authorities to pay off her son's monumental debts. She had been forced to move her few meager remaining belongings into a tiny rundown apartment on the absolute worst side of the city. There were no more private maids, no luxury sedans, and absolutely no massive trust funds left to bail her out of her miserable reality. She spent her days sitting alone at a cheap scratch table in a cramped kitchen, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. Her entire identity had been tied to her immense wealth and her fabricated superiority. But now she was just another broke, lonely old woman realizing her hollow legacy was permanently dead. Julian and Connor, the mighty corporate titans who thought they owned the entire financial district, were permanently stripped of their custom-tailored suits and their heavy, solid gold watches. They were now wearing matching bright orange institutional jumpsuits inside a bleak maximum security federal prison. Julian spent his miserable days sweeping the dusty concrete floors of the dreary recreation yard, while Connor was forced to scrub greasy tables in the loud, crowded cafeteria. Their billions of stolen offshore dollars meant absolutely nothing behind thick, reinforced steel bars and heavy concrete walls. They had completely destroyed each other in their greedy, desperate attempts to maintain power, and now they had decades of slow, agonizing time to think about their monumental failures. They were completely stripped of their precious dignity and entirely forgotten by the world they used to rule. While they rotted away in their self-made prisons, I was finally breathing freely. I stood inside the quiet, peaceful mahogany courtroom of the family law judge, wearing a sharp, elegant charcoal suit, and listened as the heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with absolute finality. The judge looked down at the extensive federal paperwork and officially granted me total, uncontested, and permanent physical and legal custody of Zoe. Julian had already signed his parental rights away while sobbing in that freezing holding cell, but hearing the judge declare it in open court lifted the absolute last heavy weight off my tired shoulders. The judge also formally granted my official petition to legally reclaim my maiden name entirely, erasing the final tainted connection I had to Julian's fraudulent existence. I was no longer defined by his lies or his toxic family. My beautiful daughter and I were entirely safe, and our future was completely secured by the powerful restructuring firm I had built with my own two hands. I walked out of the heavy courthouse doors holding Zoe's small, warm hand, stepping out into the bright, warm spring sunlight as a completely new and totally liberated woman. I returned to my pristine corner office the next morning, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace and ready to focus entirely on expanding my legitimate enterprise. Isaiah greeted me at the door with a warm, proud smile, placing a fresh cup of gourmet coffee on my pristine glass desk. The long, exhausting chaos was finally over, and the clean slate I had fought so relentlessly for was sitting right in front of me. The heavy, dark clouds had parted, and my firm was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. But just as I sat down in my leather chair to review the new quarterly projections, my secure private phone began to ring. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet office, breaking the peaceful silence. I leaned forward and glanced at the encrypted caller ID, raising an eyebrow in genuine surprise. It was the lead chairman of the board of directors for the now entirely liquidated fintech firm that Julian and Connor had completely destroyed. I slowly picked up the heavy plastic receiver and answered the call, fully expecting a frantic request for lingering legal documentation or audit files. Instead, the chairman sounded incredibly calm and deeply respectful. He cleared his throat and told me that the remaining honest board members had been quietly watching how ruthlessly and efficiently I dismantled the corrupt executive team. He said they were absolutely in awe of my strategic brilliance and my unwavering integrity. He paused for a moment, letting the heavy silence build before telling me they had a massive, unprecedented proposition for me. They wanted to completely rebuild the ruined firm from the ashes, and they needed a ruthless visionary leader to take total control of the new empire. 1 year later, the crisp winter air wrapping around the city of Atlanta felt completely different than the bitter storms that had defined the previous winter. It was Christmas Eve, and I was standing at the head of a massive polished glass boardroom table, looking out over a sea of eager, respectful faces. The prestigious Federal Regulatory Board had officially approved my final restructuring plans for the liquidated fintech firm that Julian and Connor had so recklessly destroyed. Instead of just stripping it for parts, the remaining honest board members had begged me to step in and completely take over. Earlier that morning, I had signed the final binding contracts officially merging the ashes of their former fraudulent company directly into my own rapidly expanding consulting empire. I was officially named the new chief executive officer of the largest integrated logistics and financial technology firm in the entire southeastern United States. There were no more secrets, no more hidden offshore accounts, and absolutely no more arrogant men sitting in high leather chairs pretending to be untouchable gods. The new empire was built strictly on total transparency, absolute integrity, and the relentless hard work that my father had instilled in me since I was a little girl. I looked down at the signed documents bearing my legally reclaimed maiden name, Alana Vance. It was the ultimate professional victory, completely erasing the very last lingering shadow of my miserable marriage to a pathetic criminal. Later that evening, the atmosphere inside my newly purchased downtown penthouse was incredibly warm and brilliantly alive with genuine joy. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the glowing Atlanta skyline. But the real beauty was happening right inside my living room. The air smelled richly of roasted pine sweet cinnamon and the delicious holiday dinner my private chef had prepared for our intimate gathering. There was no forced socializing, no fake country club smiles, and no desperate need to perform for people who secretly despised me. Every single person in this beautiful home was here because they were true loyal family. I stood near the kitchen island, pouring a glass of sparkling cider, and just watched the people I loved most in the world. My father Isaiah was sitting on the thick plush carpet near the towering decorated Christmas tree, with his deep, booming laugh echoing through the high ceilings. He was wearing a comfortable, thick wool sweater, looking completely relaxed and perfectly at peace, while my beautiful daughter Zoe climbed all over him. Zoe was giggling uncontrollably as she tried to wrap a long string of shiny silver garland around her grandfather's broad shoulders. The dark, heavy sadness that had briefly touched her life during the chaotic divorce was completely gone, replaced by the bright, vibrant light of a little girl who knew she was entirely safe and unconditionally loved. Sitting on the elegant velvet sofa across from them was Alicia, looking more radiant and genuinely happy than I had ever seen her. She was holding a warm mug of spiced tea and smiling brightly at Zoe's playful antics. When I first met Alicia, she was a trapped, anxious woman shrinking herself down to fit into Connor's oppressive shadow, desperately trying to maintain the fragile illusion of their elite high society life. Tonight, she was a completely transformed woman. She had taken the massive settlement she legally seized during her ruthless divorce and invested it directly into a highly successful philanthropic foundation that supported women escaping financial abuse. She had entirely shed the toxic weight of the country club expectations and found her own brilliant independence. She caught me watching her and raised her mug in a silent, heartfelt toast across the room. We had forged a deep, unbreakable friendship in the blazing fires of our mutual destruction of the men who tried to ruin us. We had both walked through absolute hell and emerged on the other side, wearing armor that nobody could ever pierce again. I raised my glass back to her, acknowledging the incredible strength it took for both of us to rewrite our own destinies and take back our stolen power. I slowly walked away from the joyful noise of the living room and stepped out onto the sprawling private balcony, letting the cool evening breeze brush against my face. The glittering lights of the sprawling city stretched out for miles in every single direction, looking like a massive sea of golden stars. I rested my hands on the smooth glass railing and looked down at the financial district where Julian's former corporate tower stood empty and dark. The contrast between my reality and theirs was absolutely staggering. Valerie was spending her Christmas in a cramped, freezing apartment entirely forgotten by the world she used to rule. Brianna was likely working a miserable holiday shift folding cheap clothes for minimum wage while hiding her face from public shame. Julian and Connor were sitting in cold concrete cells eating institutional food while wearing bright orange jumpsuits stripped of every single ounce of their arrogant pride. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or pity for any of them. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air of total freedom. I had not just gotten simple, petty revenge against the people who tried to break me. I had completely burned down an entire toxic system of generational entitlement and rebuilt a massive, beautiful empire entirely on my own terms. I heard the soft padding of little footsteps behind me and turned to see Zoe walking out onto the balcony wearing her new holiday pajamas. She reached up and wrapped her small, warm hand securely around my fingers, looking out at the glowing city lights with wide, curious eyes. I looked down at my beautiful daughter and felt a fierce, overwhelming surge of maternal pride. She would never have to learn how to make herself small to accommodate a fragile man's massive ego. She would never have to silence her own brilliant voice just to fit into a fake, superficial society's shallow mold. She was going to grow up watching her mother run a corporate empire with absolute integrity and unyielding power. She would know exactly what it means to be a strong, independent woman who refuses to be controlled by anyone. I squeezed her small hand gently, and she looked up at me with a bright, trusting smile. The long, painful war was finally over, and the beautiful, peaceful rest of our lives was just beginning. The greatest lesson from this journey is that true power never comes from fitting into a toxic system or shrinking yourself to satisfy manipulative people. Real strength comes from building your own foundation based on absolute integrity and relentless hard work. When you refuse to play their corrupt games and choose to stand firmly in your own truth, you can completely dismantle the structures meant to keep you down. You always have the power to burn away the toxicity and rebuild a beautiful life on your exact terms. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success, share your journey in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of ultimate victory.